It was just another busy afternoon at the airport, the hum of footsteps, the clink of luggage wheels rolling across the tile floor, and the ever-present drone of announcements echoing from the overhead speakers. Staff hustled between gates, pilots checked their schedules, and passengers rushed through security checks, eager to board their flights. Everything was moving like clockwork, or at least it was supposed to. The day, however, would soon veer off course, in a way no one could have predicted. Sarah, a young, eager airport employee, checked her watch for the third time in as many minutes. Her shift had just started, and she was ready to impress her supervisors. As a recent hire, Sarah had been full of optimism when she joined the airport staff. She had always dreamed of working in a bustling environment like this. But now, the reality was more chaotic than she'd expected. There were constant delays, long lines at check-in counters, and passengers who seemed to have endless complaints. She had just started to organize her workstation when David, the senior staff member with a permanent scowl etched on his face, walked by her. "Sarah," he muttered, his tone curt. "Remember, no shortcuts. Do everything by the book. If you want to last here, that's the only way." Sarah nodded, trying to ignore the stress in David's voice. He had been at the airport for years and had a reputation for being a bit of a hard-nose. Still, Sarah admired his experience and was determined to learn from him. As David walked past her, he continued his usual grumbling about how the younger generation didn't understand the importance of following protocol. Just as she began to feel a small wave of nervousness rising in her chest, a tall man in a black hoodie and sunglasses walked through the terminal. At first glance, he blended in with the crowd, like any other traveler rushing to catch his flight. But there was something about the way he carried himself that made Sarah pause. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the man had an air of confidence. No, perhaps arrogance, that seemed out of place in the usually mundane world of airport travelers. Sarah's instincts kicked in as she quickly glanced over at the security desk. The man's hoodie was low over his face, his movements quick but deliberate. A red flag went up in her mind. Had he been through security? Was he trying to sneak past the checkpoints? "David," Sarah called out, but her voice was swallowed by the noise around them. David turned, raising an eyebrow. "What is it now?" he asked, clearly irritated. "That man," Sarah said, pointing discreetly toward the figure who was now approaching the gate. "He looks suspicious. I think we should check if he's been cleared to board." David looked in the direction she was pointing and frowned. The man did look out of place, wearing dark clothes, head down, with no luggage in sight. But there was something else. He had a certain quiet, almost brooding presence. It wasn't just his appearance. It was the way the crowd seemed to part around him, almost like he was someone they recognized. "Just a moment," David muttered. "I'll handle this." Sarah followed him as they approached the mysterious traveler. As they got closer, Sarah noticed the man's distinctive features, sharp jawline, a subtle aura of authority that seemed impossible to ignore. Her gut told her that he might be someone important, but she brushed the thought aside. It was just a gut feeling, after all. "Excuse me, sir," David said, his voice stiff but professional. "Can I see your boarding pass and identification?" The man, who had barely noticed them approach, paused. He slowly pulled his sunglasses off, revealing eyes that seemed far too familiar. But Sarah didn't recognize him right away. The man was staring at David with a peculiar, almost amused expression, but he didn't say anything for a moment. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a boarding pass and an ID. David took them without a second thought, his face unreadable. He quickly glanced at the boarding pass, then back at the ID. His face twitched. There was something in his reaction, something that didn't sit well with him. A brief silence passed before he spoke again. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave the terminal," David said, his voice lowering. "You seem to be causing some disturbance, and you haven't gone through the proper checks." Sarah blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" she started to ask, but before she could finish, David was already ushering the man away from the gate. The man looked up at them, finally speaking. "I'm not causing any disturbance. I'm just trying to get to my flight," he said, his voice calm but sharp, like the hum of an electrical current. But David, in his frustration, was unmoved. I don't care who you are, David snapped. Rules are rules. You're either leaving now, or I'm calling security. Sarah watched in disbelief as the man's face shifted. There was a brief flicker of confusion, followed by something else. Resignation? Maybe? He sighed, as if the whole situation was beneath him. Still, he didn't argue. Instead, he turned on his heel and, without a word, walked toward the exit. Sarah's mind raced. This man, whoever he was, had just been treated with complete disrespect. But at that moment, she didn't have time to think it through. David was already moving back to his post, leaving her standing there, lost in the whirlwind of the interaction. It wasn't until later that evening, when Sarah saw her phone light up with notifications, that the magnitude of the situation truly hit her. A viral video had surfaced, showing the exchange between David and the mysterious traveler. The man was no ordinary person. It wasn't just any random person they had kicked out. The world now knew it was Elon Musk, CEO of Tesla and SpaceX. The realization sent a cold chill through Sarah's spine. What had they done? The incident exploded across social media. Headlines read, "Airport staff kicked out Elon Musk." But why? News stations were scrambling for answers, speculating on why such an influential figure had been treated so poorly by staff. Interviews with passengers who witnessed the interaction began flooding in, with most offering sympathetic opinions about Elon's treatment. Sarah stood frozen, staring at her phone as the weight of the situation began to dawn on her. She had been there. She had witnessed it all. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. One of the viral videos began. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Sarah couldn't help but wonder. Was this really the end? Or was this only the beginning of something far bigger than any of them could have imagined? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The day after the incident, the atmosphere at the airport was thick with tension. It wasn't just the usual hustle and bustle that had filled the terminal the day before. No, today there was something else, an undercurrent of anxiety, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Sarah couldn't focus. She'd been replaying the incident over and over in her mind, questioning everything she'd done. The image of Elon Musk, being escorted out of the terminal, his calm, almost amused expression stuck in her head. It was hard to believe what had happened. Harder still was the realization that she had played a part in it. She'd been trying to follow the rules, yes, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd missed something. Maybe it was the way she'd let David take charge, the way she'd hesitated when she felt a niggling sense that something was off. Either way, the knowledge that she had helped make that mistake gnawed at her. As she walked through the staff lounge, her eyes found David, sitting at a table near the back, staring blankly at his coffee cup. He didn't look up as she passed. The same scowl was there, as usual. David was an imposing figure, tall, with a square jaw and dark eyes that always seemed to be sizing people up. He'd been working at the airport for as long as Sarah could remember, well before she started her job here. In fact, she had admired him from the moment she walked in on her first day. He had an air of confidence that made him seem unshakable. And though his strict demeanor often made him hard to approach, Sarah thought that, deep down, he cared about the job. Then there was Mark, the supervisor. Mark was different. Where David exuded a no-nonsense attitude, Mark was more approachable. He had a calm, collected presence that seemed to put people at ease, even in the most stressful situations. He was the kind of guy who would talk you through a problem, but he could also make quick decisions when necessary. He had the natural ability to lead, and that's why he was the one everyone went to when things got complicated. However, today Mark looked more tense than usual. His face was creased with worry, and his movements were quick, as though he were trying to keep up with something faster than he could handle. He was holding his phone in one hand, glancing at the screen every few seconds. He caught sight of Sarah and David as they crossed paths, but his attention seemed lost somewhere else. Sarah walked up to the table where Mark sat. "Hey," she started, keeping her voice light. "Everything okay?" Mark didn't immediately respond. His eyes flicked to her, then back to his phone. "No, Sarah, Everything's not okay, he muttered, his tone flat. Did you see the news? Sarah nodded, anxiety pooling in her stomach. Yeah, I saw it. It's all over the place, Mark continued, his fingers tapping nervously on the phone screen. The whole airport's been blasted for how we treated him. And now, people are talking about it. Big time. Sarah's heart sank. Do you think they're going to fire us? Mark finally looked up, his eyes filled with frustration. I don't know. It's possible. What I do know is that we've got a problem on our hands. Elon Musk doesn't get treated like that, and if we don't fix it soon, we're all going to pay for it. David, who had been listening in from across the room, suddenly stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Fix it? He repeated with a bitter laugh. It's too late to fix anything. The damage is done. We kicked out one of the most influential men in the world, and now it's all over the news. No amount of apologizing is going to fix that. Sarah watched David, unsure whether he was talking to himself or to Mark. His words were harsh, and the hopelessness in his voice was undeniable. But something about it didn't sit right with her. Could they really not do anything to make it right? David was quick to leave the lounge, his footsteps heavy as he walked toward the exit. Mark watched him go, then turned to Sarah. David's got a point, he admitted. But we still have to try. This isn't about saving face. It's about making things right. We owe him an apology. All of us. Sarah's throat tightened. Apologizing to Elon Musk? How could they possibly do that after what had happened? What would he even want with an apology from people like them? But as the thought lingered in her mind, Sarah knew one thing for sure. She couldn't just let this slide. She had to do something. She had to at least try. The next few hours dragged on as Sarah mulled over her options. After work, she headed home, unable to shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her chest. It was a restless night. Her mind kept circling back to the thought of Elon Musk, the man they had kicked out of the airport. The following morning, as Sarah walked through the airport's entrance, she found herself in an entirely different world. The staff members were still going through the usual motions, but now it all seemed different. Everything felt under a microscope. The glare of public attention was on them, even if it hadn't fully sunk in yet. She glanced at Mark when she entered the lounge. He was sitting at his usual spot, surrounded by paperwork, though his usual calm was nowhere to be found. Sarah took a deep breath and approached him. I think we need to do something, she said quietly, sitting down beside him. Mark looked up, his face tired but resolute. What do you have in mind? I think we need to reach out to him. I don't know how, but we need to apologize, Sarah said, her voice steadying as she spoke. Mark nodded slowly. I've been thinking the same thing. But do you think he'll even care? Do you think he'll even listen to us? I don't know, Sarah admitted. But we have to try. If we don't, we'll just be stuck in this mess forever. For a long moment, Mark stared at his desk, lost in thought. Then, without another word, he grabbed his phone and dialed. Sarah watched him. Her heart pounded in her chest. Whatever happened next could change everything. As Mark set the phone down with a heavy sigh, Sarah felt the air around her grow thick with anticipation. The conversation had been brief, and Mark's face was unreadable. We'll see him, Mark said, his voice a little softer now. Elon Musk is willing to meet us, but we'll need to head to SpaceX headquarters to do it. Sarah's eyes widened. SpaceX? Yes. And we're not backing out now. Mark looked at her with a strange mix of determination and uncertainty. Are you ready for this? Sarah swallowed hard, her heart racing. I'm ready, she said, though inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to change in ways they could never have imagined. The next few hours felt like a blur to Sarah. As soon as Mark had received the call from the SpaceX team, everything changed. The calm of the airport, the hum of everyday activity, the routines of the staff, it all vanished. In its place, an unexpected whirlwind of tension and excitement took over. Sarah had no idea how to prepare for what was coming. A meeting with Elon Musk at SpaceX headquarters? It sounded surreal. She kept replaying Mark's words in her head. We'll see him. We'll meet him at SpaceX. It was hard to wrap her mind around it, but there was no time to waste. It was just after lunch when the team was officially briefed. Mark, Sarah, and David were gathered in the back office, the air thick with nervous energy. The other staff members had been buzzing about the situation, but now it was real. Mark had told them to pack their things. They were going to Hawthorne, California, to meet the man they had so publicly disrespected. "I can't believe this is happening," David muttered under his breath, pacing around the office. His mood had shifted from the bitterness of earlier to a kind of reluctant compliance. He hadn't been thrilled about the whole apology idea, but now that they were going to SpaceX, the gravity of the situation had hit him, too. Mark stood by the door, his arms crossed, his expression as serious as ever. "This is our shot, guys. This is the only chance we get to make things right. If we mess this up, we might lose our jobs. This is bigger than just us. This is about representing the airport, too." Sarah, still processing everything, nodded. She was nervous, but she couldn't deny that there was a flicker of excitement in her chest. This could be her chance to show the world that she was more than just another face in the crowd, that she had the courage to own up to a mistake, even if it seemed like an impossible one to fix. They were soon led to the airport's private hangar, where they would be whisked away on a flight to California. As Sarah buckled herself into her seat on the small private plane, she couldn't help but stare out the window, wondering what was going to happen next. Was this really happening? Was she really about to meet Elon Musk? The flight passed quickly, and before long, they landed in Hawthorne, where the famed SpaceX headquarters was located. As the plane taxied to a private runway, Sarah's stomach tightened with each passing second. It wasn't until they disembarked and were led toward the main building that the true enormity of the situation hit her. Mark was walking briskly ahead, his posture stiff with resolve. David, meanwhile, had gone quiet, lost in thought. He hadn't said much since the plane took off, and Sarah could sense his unease. But then again, she felt the same way. They were walking into the lion's den, and they didn't know how the beast would react. They passed through an enormous glass door into the building, and Sarah was immediately struck by the stark, futuristic vibe of SpaceX's headquarters. The high ceilings and sleek architecture gave off an air of innovation. Everywhere she looked, engineers and employees were focused on their tasks, preparing spacecraft, discussing new designs, and tinkering with cutting-edge technology. The place was alive with energy, purpose, and potential. Elon Musk, the genius behind it all, was a legend here. And now, he was the person they had to apologize to. As they entered the building, they were greeted by a woman in a sharp suit. Her name was Carla, and she was the liaison assigned to oversee their meeting with Elon. "Welcome to SpaceX," Carla said with a smile, though there was a clear professionalism in her tone. "Mr. Musk is expecting you. He'll be with you shortly." The room they were led to was modern, with minimalist decor, and a view that overlooked the sprawling SpaceX campus. A long conference table dominated the space, and Carla motioned for them to sit down. "So, here's the deal," Carla said as she took a seat across from them. "Mr. Musk doesn't hold grudges, but he's also not someone who likes to waste time. If you're here, it's because he thinks you have something important to say. But I'll warn you, if he doesn't like what he hears, this conversation will be short." Sarah could feel the heat of her own nervousness rise. Elon Musk. Just the thought of it made her palms sweat. Was he really going to listen to them? Would he care about their apology, or would this meeting be another wasted effort? Before she could get lost in her thoughts, the door opened, and a figure walked in. Elon Musk. He wasn't as imposing in person as Sarah had imagined. He was tall, with a lean build, dressed casually in a black t-shirt and jeans. But there was an undeniable presence about him. His eyes, sharp and curious, met theirs as he took a seat at the table. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "So, you're the ones who kicked me out of the airport yesterday," he said, his tone direct but not unfriendly. There was a quiet amusement in his voice, like he was watching a science experiment unfold. Sarah swallowed. She was the first to speak, as the others seemed to be frozen in place. "Mr. Musk," she began, trying to steady her voice, "we're here because we made a mistake. We didn't recognize who you were, and we acted hastily. We just want to apologize for how you were treated." There was a brief silence before Elon leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "I'm listening." Mark cleared his throat. "We understand the importance of the work you do, Mr. Musk, and we take full responsibility for what happened. We've always prided ourselves on professionalism, and we fell short. That's on us." David, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. "I've been working in airports for over 15 years. I should have known better. I let my frustration get the better of me, and I'm sorry for the way I treated you." Elon looked at them, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Sarah wondered if they had made a huge mistake. But then, something shifted in his gaze. His lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. "You know," he said, his voice surprisingly calm, "it's not often I get treated like that. But I understand. Airports are stressful places. Everyone's trying to get somewhere. And I'm not exactly your average traveler." Sarah couldn't believe her ears. He was actually being understanding. "We're truly sorry, Mr. Musk," she repeated. "We just didn't realize who you were in the moment." Elon nodded slowly. "I get it. No hard feelings. But in the future, maybe try to recognize your passengers before you kick them out." A small chuckle escaped from David. It was the first time all day that he seemed relaxed. Elon's casual attitude made everything feel a little less serious, and for the first time, Sarah could feel the weight lifting off her shoulders. "You're free to go, but I'd love to give you a tour of SpaceX before you head out," Elon added. "It's the least I can do." The offer was unexpected. An invitation to tour one of the most innovative companies in the world? Sarah and her colleagues exchanged uncertain glances, but it was clear that the tension had evaporated. They'd come in expecting a confrontation, but instead, they were walking out with an experience they would never forget. As they followed Elon through the sprawling halls of SpaceX, Sarah's mind raced with the realization. They'd started this day with dread, but now they were witnessing history in the making. This wasn't just an apology anymore. It was the beginning of something bigger, something that would forever change the course of their lives. And little did they know, this was only the first step of the journey. The twists and turns ahead would be far more incredible than any of them could imagine. The buzz of excitement was palpable as Sarah, Mark, David, and the others followed Elon Musk through the sleek corridors of SpaceX headquarters. Everything around them seemed futuristic, like stepping into a world from a science fiction novel. The walls were lined with glass panels displaying blueprints and sleek designs for spacecraft, rockets, and advanced technology that Sarah couldn't even begin to comprehend. They walked past engineers hunched over workstations, deep in concentration, each person absorbed in their own part of the grand vision. The hum of innovation filled the air, an energy that seemed to pulse through the building. It was like every corner they turned brought them closer to something extraordinary. Elon moved with ease, his casual presence somehow making the whole environment feel less intimidating. As they reached a large viewing platform overlooking a massive hangar, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There, standing in the center of the room, was one of the most incredible machines she'd ever seen. A Falcon Heavy rocket. It loomed above them, its polished exterior gleaming under the bright lights. The sheer scale of it left Sarah speechless. The room felt charged with potential, as though the entire future of humanity could be shaped by the work done within these walls. "Here it is," Elon said, stopping near the railing, gesturing to the rocket below. "The Falcon Heavy, the most powerful operational rocket in the world. We're aiming to take humans to Mars with it. Pretty exciting, don't you think?" Sarah nodded, trying to process the weight of the statement. She'd heard about SpaceX's ambitious goals, but standing in the presence of such a monumental project made it all real. Elon's words were casual, but the scale of what he was talking about was mind-boggling. Sending humans to Mars was no small feat. It was a vision that could change the course of history. They continued the tour, passing through research labs, conference rooms filled with strategy meetings, and areas where engineers and designers were testing and fine-tuning their latest prototypes. Each step felt more surreal than the last, like they were walking through the future itself. Sarah felt like a small piece in a much bigger puzzle, but somehow, it was thrilling. As they entered a private testing room, Elon stopped and turned to face them. His expression softened slightly, and for a moment, he seemed less like the larger-than-life figure everyone talked about and more like a regular guy. "You guys have seen the rocket, but there's something else I want to show you." Sarah exchanged curious glances with the others. What could be more impressive than the Falcon Heavy? Elon led them to a corner of the room, where a small electric car sat under a tarp. He removed the cover with a flourish, revealing the sleek design of a Tesla Roadster. It looked futuristic, even by modern standards, but the fact that it was an electric car made it all the more striking. Elon smiled at their odd expressions. This is what we're doing here too. We're not just looking at rockets and space exploration. We're building a sustainable future for Earth too. It hit Sarah then, as she stood there in the presence of this visionary man. Elon Musk wasn't just a billionaire tech mogul. He was a force of nature, propelling humanity toward new frontiers. His vision wasn't limited to space. It spanned everything, from energy solutions to transportation and beyond. The tour continued for what felt like hours. Elon took them through a section where they could see engineers working on Starship, SpaceX's next-generation spacecraft designed for long-duration space travel. The sheer ambition of the project was staggering. Sarah could barely keep up with the technical jargon, but the excitement in the air was infectious. There was a palpable sense that they were all part of something revolutionary. But despite the awe-inspiring technologies and innovations all around them, one question lingered in Sarah's mind. Why had Elon agreed to meet with them at all? They were just airport staff, people who had made a mistake. Surely, someone like him had more important things to do. After a while, the tour seemed to slow, and they made their way to a conference room, where Elon suggested they sit and talk. The team took their places around a long, polished table, the weight of their earlier apology still hanging in the air. Mark was the first to speak after a few moments of silence. Mr. Musk, we can't thank you enough for this opportunity. We know we made a huge mistake, and we just want to make sure we do everything we can to fix it. Elon leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together, as though he were contemplating their words. He gave a small nod before responding. I appreciate you coming here. Apologies are good, but actions speak louder than words, don't you think? Sarah blinked, unsure if he was hinting at something deeper. Was there more they needed to do to prove their sincerity? Elon's lips curled into a small smile. The truth is, I've been on the receiving end of some bad treatment in my life. It happens. But here's the thing. I don't hold grudges. I don't need an apology to move forward. What I care about is that you learn from this, that you understand the bigger picture. Sarah could hardly believe what she was hearing. Here they were, expecting the worst, and yet Elon Musk was treating them with more grace and understanding than they had ever imagined. He didn't care about the past mistake. He cared about the future. He continued, you guys work at an airport. It's chaotic, stressful, but mistakes are inevitable. The key is what you do after the mistake is made. Do you grow from it? Do you learn? Do you make sure it doesn't happen again? Mark nodded slowly, taking in Elon's words. We'll do better, he said firmly. David, who had been unusually quiet during the tour, finally spoke. We were wrong. We know that now. We'll make sure something like this never happens again. Elon gave a satisfied nod. I like that attitude, he said. Now, I don't think you need me to tell you that the world is watching. You've been in the spotlight for the wrong reasons, but you have a chance to use this to grow. Don't waste it. For the first time since arriving, Sarah felt a sense of calm settle over her. She had been bracing for confrontation, for a harsh lecture, but instead, she was receiving an unexpected gift, a second chance. The conversation turned to lighter topics as the afternoon wore on. They talked about the future of transportation, space exploration, and the potential of sustainable energy. Elon was animated as he spoke, his passion for his work shining through with every word. He made it clear that he was determined to push the boundaries of what was possible, and it was impossible not to be swept up in his enthusiasm. As the meeting came to a close, Elon stood up, offering them a hand. It was good to meet you all. I'm glad we could clear the air. And who knows, maybe you'll be seeing more of me in the future. Just try not to kick me out of the airport next time, he said with a wink. The tension that had once filled the room was now replaced with a sense of relief. As Sarah, Mark, and David stood up to leave, they couldn't help but feel that they had been part of something larger than themselves. They had come here to apologize, to right a wrong, but what they were walking away with was far more valuable. A lesson in humility, growth, and understanding. And as they stepped back into the bright California sunlight, they realized that their lives had indeed changed. They had just met one of the most visionary people on the planet, and in doing so, they had learned the importance of second chances. They were no longer the team that had made a mistake. They were the team that was ready to move forward. And who knew? Maybe the best was yet to come. Little did they know, this was only the beginning. There was still much more to come, and the consequences of their actions would continue to unfold in ways they could never have predicted. Sarah sat in the quiet of her apartment later that evening, staring out the window at the twinkling lights of the city below. Her mind was still racing, replaying everything that had happened throughout the day. It was surreal. Just a few hours ago, she had been standing in the midst of a SpaceX facility, listening to Elon Musk speak with the kind of ease and humility that defied everything she had expected from such a high-profile figure. Despite her exhaustion, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of awe. She had been part of something so much bigger than herself. A moment that could change the course of her life and, in some strange way, the way she looked at her career, her decisions, and her ability to make mistakes and grow from them. She pulled her phone from her pocket and scrolled through her messages. There were a few texts from her friends and family, all of them checking in after the incident. Everyone had heard about what happened. The news had spread like wildfire. Sarah winced when she saw the dozens of notifications, each one a reminder of the humiliation that had followed the airport incident. The ridicule, the memes, the jokes. It had all been a lot to handle. But now, with the meeting at SpaceX behind her, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. She clicked on a message from Mark. "Mark, you did great today. No one expected it to go down like that. But you were calm, you were professional, and you handled it like a pro. We all have a chance to make things right now." Sarah smiled at the text. Mark was right. They had a chance to move forward, to learn from the situation and do better. As much as she had dreaded the aftermath of the incident, today's meeting with Elon Musk had given her something she hadn't thought possible, a second chance. But what now? She had no answers. The airport staff, the media, her coworkers, they were all going to be watching her. Watching them. What if this didn't work out? What if they couldn't recover from the embarrassment? But the thought of the last words Elon had spoken to her rang clear in her mind. Mistakes are inevitable. The key is what you do after. Sarah wasn't sure if she was ready to face the world again, but she knew one thing for sure. She was done being stuck in the past. The next morning came quickly, and with it, a new day and new possibilities. Sarah arrived at the airport, the familiar walls and buzzing terminals now feeling different. She had done something monumental in her own way, and she was going to take ownership of it. Mark and David were already there when she arrived. "Morning," Mark greeted, his usual stern expression softened by a hint of optimism. "Ready to get to work?" Sarah nodded. "I think I am." There was still an awkward tension in the air between the group, but it felt different, less heavy. They had all been through something that few others could understand, and somehow, it bonded them. They were no longer the team that had failed. They were a team that had an opportunity to do better. As they made their way to the office, the buzz of the terminal was interrupted by a sudden flurry of activity. A group of reporters had gathered outside the gates, cameras flashing as they asked questions about the airport incident. It was inevitable. They had all known the press would be all over the situation. But Sarah wasn't as anxious as she thought she would be. She had been to the media circus before, after all. Only now, it wasn't the same. It wasn't just a mistake to hide anymore. It was a chance to explain, to make sure that this moment meant something. "We should address this head-on," Mark said, taking a deep breath as they approached the group of reporters. "Yeah," Sarah agreed, her nerves now surprisingly steady. "Let's face it. Let's do it right this time." They stepped forward, and the cameras turned toward them, capturing the moment. It wasn't just about Elon Musk anymore. It was about them, their story, their growth. The reporters fired off questions, most of them about the incident itself, and others about their meeting with Musk. Sarah listened carefully, her eyes steady and calm as she addressed them. "First, I want to say that what happened was wrong," she began, her voice clear. "We misjudged the situation, and we failed in the way we treated a guest. But we've learned from it. We've apologized. and we've been given the chance to do better." The reporters scribbled in their notebooks, the cameras clicking away as Sarah continued. "Our meeting with Mr. Musk was a chance for us to learn, not just about our mistake, but about the importance of second chances. SpaceX is doing incredible things, and today, we were given the opportunity to see how much impact one person's vision can have on the world. We're grateful for that, and we are committed to learning from this experience to ensure it never happens again." Sarah felt a sense of pride in her words. It wasn't a typical corporate apology. It was raw, real, and personal. She wasn't just talking about how they messed up. She was talking about how they were moving forward from it. As the press conference wrapped up, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. This was the turning point. The awkwardness of the past few days was behind her. The apology had been made, and now they had to prove they were capable of living up to the second chance they'd been given. Weeks passed, and things began to settle. Sarah, Mark, and David found themselves taking on new responsibilities at the airport. They were all working harder than ever to restore their reputation. The media attention had died down, but the memory of the incident remained. It was a reminder of how quickly things could go wrong, but also of the incredible potential of redemption. Sarah found herself waking up each day with a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just going to let this mistake define her. She wasn't going to be the airport worker who kicked out Elon Musk. She was going to be the person who learned, grew, and made it right. And then one afternoon, an email arrived that would change everything once again. It was from SpaceX. "Dear Sarah, Mark, and David, we would like to invite you to attend the upcoming SpaceX launch event. Mr. Musk personally requested your presence as a gesture of appreciation for your willingness to own up to your mistake and for the integrity you've shown in moving forward. Please find the details for the event below." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Could this really be happening? She read the email again, just to make sure. Yes, it was real. SpaceX had invited them to attend a live launch. It wasn't just a follow-up. It was an opportunity to witness history. She quickly forwarded the email to Mark and David. A few seconds later, her phone buzzed with Mark's response. "Mark, this is huge. We're being recognized for more than just our mistake. We're being recognized for what comes after. We have to be ready for this." And just like that, their journey took another unexpected turn. What had started as a mistake was evolving into something much bigger. For the first time, Sarah felt that everything had come full circle. The past was no longer a burden. It was a reminder of the possibilities that came from owning up, learning, and growing. The future was unfolding before her eyes, and there was no turning back. The days leading up to the SpaceX launch felt like a blur for Sarah. She could hardly believe what had been unfolding. An invitation from SpaceX to attend a live launch wasn't just a rare opportunity. It was a clear sign that they were being welcomed into something extraordinary, something that went beyond the mistake at the airport. This was their chance to make up for everything and prove they could handle the responsibility of redemption. Sarah, Mark, and David spent hours poring over the details of the event. The launch would take place in Cape Canaveral, and they were flying in 2 days before the scheduled event. The email was clear. This would be an exclusive event, and they would get a front-row seat to one of the most anticipated launches in recent years. Sarah packed her bags the night before, and as she stood in front of the mirror, she couldn't help but reflect on the whirlwind of the past few weeks. The mistake had been the catalyst for everything: the press, the meeting with Elon Musk, the apology, and now this. It felt like everything had come full circle, but there was still so much left to prove. The flight to Florida was a mix of nerves and excitement. Sarah sat next to Mark, who was nervously checking his phone. David sat across from them, flipping through a book about space technology. They were quiet but excited. As the plane began its descent into Orlando International Airport, Sarah could see the vast stretch of the Atlantic coastline below. Her heart fluttered with anticipation. Once they landed, they were whisked away by a SpaceX driver to a nearby hotel, where they were given VIP access and told that the launch site was a short drive away. The hotel was a lavish affair, with sleek modern decor and incredible views of the ocean. It wasn't lost on Sarah that just a few weeks ago, they had been at the center of an embarrassing incident, and now here they were, staying in a luxury hotel at the edge of space exploration. The morning of the launch arrived, and the trio was escorted to the Cape Canaveral launch site in a black SUV. The air was thick with excitement, and the security surrounding the event was tight. There were dozens of employees, engineers, and media personnel milling about, all with their eyes trained on the towering Falcon 9 rocket standing tall on the launch pad. Sarah could feel her pulse quicken as they approached the viewing area. This was it, the culmination of everything they had gone through. This wasn't just about witnessing history. It was about understanding the power of innovation, perseverance, and vision. And it was about learning from their past mistakes and being part of something bigger. Once they arrived, they were led to a designated area where VIP guests could stand and watch the countdown. SpaceX had even provided them with ear protection, because the launch was going to be loud, they said. Sarah stood in awe, looking out over the launch pad. The rocket, bathed in sunlight, was a work of art. Its sleek silver body gleamed in the early morning light, and she could see engineers walking around it, making final checks, ensuring everything was perfect. Elon himself is going to be here shortly, a SpaceX team member told them, smiling. He's making sure everything goes smoothly. Sarah couldn't believe it. Elon Musk, the man who had so graciously accepted their apology and showed them kindness, was about to stand right in front of them again. As they made their way toward a small viewing area near the base of the rocket, Sarah felt a wave of emotion wash over her. This wasn't just a chance to witness a launch. This was a milestone in her own journey. From the airport incident to this moment, it felt like she had come so far. Like she had transcended the embarrassment and come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more connected to the world around her. The countdown began. T-minus 10 minutes. Sarah could hear the hum of the crowd around her, but she was focused entirely on the rocket. The sound of the rocket's engines could be heard rumbling in the distance. The excitement in the air was palpable. Mark and David exchanged glances, both of them too overwhelmed to speak. They had each been through their own personal transformation, and now, standing here together, they could feel the weight of the moment. As the seconds ticked down, a voice boomed through the loudspeakers. T-minus 5 minutes. The crowd held its collective breath. Sarah's mind raced, thinking about how far they had come. This wasn't just a visit to see a rocket launch. It was a moment of reconciliation, a moment of learning, and a moment of being part of something that could change the future of humanity. A small, humble mistake had led to something much greater than she could have imagined. T-minus 1 minute. The rumbling noise grew louder, and Sarah could feel the vibrations under her feet. Her heart was pounding in her chest. This was real. This was happening. Here we go, Mark whispered. Sarah nodded, barely able to take her eyes off the rocket. The countdown was nearly over, and the energy around her was electric. Finally, the moment arrived. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. With every second, the anticipation was nearly unbearable. Sarah held her breath. Everything felt like it was building to a crescendo. It wasn't just the launch. It was what it represented. The future, the unknown, the courage to push past failure and keep moving forward. 3, 2, 1, liftoff. A deafening roar filled the air as the Falcon 9 rocket launched from the pad, the flames from its engines lighting up the sky. The sheer force of the takeoff shook the ground beneath them, and the massive trail of smoke and fire left a brilliant streak in the blue sky. Sarah could barely hear herself think. The entire crowd erupted in applause, cheering as the rocket soared higher and higher into the atmosphere. There were no words to describe the overwhelming sense of awe and wonder she felt in that moment. This was the future. Elon Musk appeared beside them just after the launch, his usual calm and collected demeanor unchanged by the spectacle they had just witnessed. He flashed a quick smile at the group, offering a simple nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't the kind of grand statement Sarah had expected. It was understated, yet powerful, just like the man himself. "That's how you make history," Elon said, his voice calm yet filled with quiet pride. Sarah's mind was still reeling. She had watched a rocket launch, yes, but more importantly, she had witnessed the realization of a vision, one that could change everything for humanity. And in that moment, she realized that the lesson of the past few weeks wasn't just about forgiving mistakes or seeking redemption. It was about being part of something bigger than yourself. As the event came to a close, and the crowd began to disperse. Sarah found herself standing in awe of the rocket as it climbed higher into the sky. She looked around at her friends, her colleagues, and even Elon, and realized that this moment wasn't just a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It was a turning point. Their journey had started with an airport incident, but it had led them here, to this moment of shared achievement. The launch had been a symbol of second chances, of growth, and of the potential for human innovation. And as Sarah walked away from the launch site, she knew that no matter what came next, she would carry the lessons of this experience with her forever. The future was waiting, and this was only the beginning. The weeks following the launch felt surreal to Sarah. As she returned to her routine at the airport, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere around her. Her colleagues had begun to look at her differently, some with newfound respect, others with curiosity. It wasn't that they saw her as a hero. They were just beginning to understand that her story was more than a mistake. It was about resilience, about growth, about transformation. Sarah had learned something invaluable over the last few weeks. Sometimes the hardest mistakes lead to the most unexpected opportunities. That day at the airport, when they had mistakenly kicked out Elon Musk, had felt like the end of everything. But instead, it had been the beginning of something much larger than she could have imagined. Her phone buzzed as she sat at her desk, scrolling through her messages. It was another email from SpaceX. Subject: Upcoming SpaceX collaboration opportunity. Dear Sarah, we were impressed with your professionalism, resilience, and willingness to learn after the recent incident. We believe that you and your team would be a great asset to an upcoming collaboration. We would like to discuss potential opportunities for you to work with us on future initiatives. Please let us know your availability for a virtual meeting. Sincerely, the SpaceX team. Sarah read the email twice, then a third time, almost not believing what she was seeing. This wasn't just about their redemption anymore. This was about their future. SpaceX was offering them a chance to collaborate. She immediately called Mark. You won't believe this, she said breathlessly. SpaceX wants to work with us. They're offering us a collaboration opportunity. Mark was silent for a moment. Sarah could hear his voice crackling with disbelief. Are you serious? I'm serious. They're setting up a virtual meeting to discuss it. We have to make this happen, Mark said firmly. This could be the break we've been waiting for. Sarah agreed. It was hard to believe that just a few weeks ago, they had been the laughingstock of the media. Now, SpaceX, one of the most innovative companies in the world, was reaching out to them. The thought of working with such a groundbreaking company was beyond anything she had imagined when she first started working at the airport. As the day went on, Sarah couldn't focus. The email kept playing in her mind. She wondered what kind of collaboration SpaceX was referring to. Were they going to work on something related to aerospace or technology? Or was it something more aligned with the operations of the airport? Whatever it was, this could be the next big step in their careers. The meeting with SpaceX was scheduled for the following week. Sarah and her team spent the next few days preparing for the virtual conference, researching the latest developments from SpaceX and brainstorming ways they could contribute to future projects. The day of the meeting arrived. Sarah sat at her desk, her heart pounding in her chest. Mark and David sat beside her in the conference room, all three of them watching the computer screen as the Zoom call loaded. The anticipation was overwhelming. This was more than a meeting. It was a chance to reshape their futures. Finally, the screen flickered, and the familiar faces of the SpaceX team appeared. Elon Musk wasn't on the call, but there were several high-ranking members of the company, including engineers, project managers, and public relations experts. Good morning, Sarah. Mark, David, one of the engineers, Alex, greeted. Thank you for joining us today. We've been really impressed with the way you've handled the recent events and your commitment to learning from your mistakes. We believe there's a great deal of potential for you to be involved in some of our upcoming projects. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. This was it. Thank you for giving us this opportunity, Sarah responded, her voice steady despite the nervousness that bubbled up inside her. We're excited about the possibility of working together. Alex smiled. We've been thinking about how your team could help us with logistics and operations for some of our upcoming events. Specifically, we're planning a spaceport expansion and need a team with strong operational experience to help us with the project management side of things. We've been keeping an eye on your team and the way you've handled your airport operations, and we believe you're the perfect fit." Sarah's mind raced. This was the type of work that could propel her career to a whole new level. A spaceport expansion, that was something she never thought she'd be involved in, but here she was, being considered for a major project with SpaceX. She glanced at Mark and David, who were equally stunned but eager. "This could be a massive opportunity," Mark said, his eyes wide. "But we're also ready to step up and make this work." Alex continued, outlining the specifics of the project. SpaceX was looking for a team that could handle the intricacies of spaceport operations, everything from traffic control to logistics and customer service. They needed a group that could keep things running smoothly while also aligning with the cutting-edge goals of SpaceX's expansion plans. "This could be your opportunity to be a part of the new frontier of space exploration," Alex said. "What do you think?" Sarah looked at her team. There was no doubt in her mind. They were ready. They had come so far, and now they were being offered the chance of a lifetime. "We're in," Sarah said confidently. "We'll do whatever it takes to make this happen." The SpaceX team smiled, and the meeting continued as they discussed the next steps for getting their team involved in the project. As the meeting wrapped up and the Zoom call ended, Sarah sat back in her chair, trying to absorb everything that had just happened. "We just made history," David said, breaking the silence. "This is huge." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with pride. It was hard to believe how far they had come. A few months ago, they had been kicked out of the airport by one of the most influential figures in the world. Now, they were about to be part of something that could change the course of history. She looked at Mark and David, her team, her friends, and knew that this was just the beginning. Whatever came next, they were ready for it. As the days passed, Sarah's life began to change in ways she never could have imagined. The work with SpaceX became a driving force in her life. They began attending meetings, learning from engineers, and diving deep into the technicalities of space operations. The future seemed limitless. But amidst the excitement of the collaboration, Sarah never forgot the lesson she had learned. Even the most humiliating mistakes could lead to the most extraordinary opportunities. As the weeks progressed, Sarah, Mark, and David threw themselves into the SpaceX project with everything they had. The excitement of being a part of something revolutionary kept them energized, but it also brought its own set of challenges. The work was fast-paced and intense, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt the pressure of truly making her mark on something monumental. They weren't just employees doing a job. They were now integral to the success of a cutting-edge operation in the world of space exploration. Despite the enthusiasm, doubts crept in. The tasks ahead of them were far from easy. Managing logistics for a spaceport expansion wasn't like coordinating routine airport operations. It was a whole new ballgame. The scale of the operations was mind-boggling. Everything had to be perfect, every detail had to be accounted for, and the consequences of failure were unthinkable. Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. When they first got the opportunity, it had felt like a dream. Now, as they dove into the details, the reality of the responsibility began to hit home. Would they be able to rise to the occasion, or would they crumble under the pressure? Sarah's thoughts were interrupted when Mark came into her office one morning with a serious expression. "We have a problem," he said, his voice tight. Sarah looked up from her desk, sensing the gravity in his tone. "What's going on?" Mark sat down across from her. "The timeline for the spaceport expansion is a lot tighter than we were told. We need to move faster than we thought if we're going to stay on track. And there's a chance we might not be able to meet those deadlines if we don't adjust some of our plans." Sarah frowned, processing the information. This was the kind of problem they had been warned about. Working on high-profile projects like this was bound to come with unexpected complications. But hearing it for the first time was still a shock. They had been working so hard, and now, it felt like the rug was being pulled out from under them. "What's the solution?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the worry creeping in. Mark looked uncomfortable. "We're going to have to make some tough decisions. We might need to let go of certain aspects of the plan or cut corners in some areas. But we're running out of time, and I don't think we have another choice." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. Cutting corners wasn't an option. They had come this far. There was no way they could risk jeopardizing everything now. But what else could they do? The stakes were too high. "We need to figure this out," Sarah said firmly. "This project is too important, not just for us, but for everyone involved. We need to find a way to stay on track without compromising." Mark nodded, but his expression was full of uncertainty. "I'll start reworking the schedule and try to see where we can adjust, but this is going to take everything we've got." Sarah didn't doubt his abilities, but she also knew that this was bigger than any of them. They couldn't afford to make mistakes now. The pressure continued to mount as the days passed. Sarah spent late nights at her desk, working alongside Mark and David to come up with solutions. They strategized, reviewed plans, and reassessed every decision they had made. It was grueling work, but they couldn't back down. There was too much on the line now. Not just their careers, but their reputations and the future of the entire project. It was around this time that they received another email from SpaceX, this time with a subject line that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. Subject: SpaceX inspection team coming for evaluation. The email informed them that a SpaceX inspection team would be arriving in just a few days to evaluate their progress on the spaceport expansion. The team would be assessing everything, from logistics to operational readiness, and they needed to be prepared for a comprehensive evaluation. "This is it," Sarah said to Mark and David as she read the email aloud. "We've been working toward this, but now we really have to show them that we can handle it. We can't afford to slip up." David, who had been silent for most of the meeting, finally spoke up. "We've been pushing ourselves harder than we ever have before, but we've also learned more in the past few weeks than we could have imagined. We're not going to fail this test." Sarah looked at her two colleagues and smiled. It was clear that they were in this together. They had come so far, and they weren't about to let this opportunity slip through their fingers now. The inspection team arrived 2 days later, and the pressure in the air was palpable. The trio made sure that everything was in place, from the operational schedules to the logistics plans. They had meticulously gone through every detail, but now they had to execute it flawlessly. The inspection team was led by Lena Carlson, SpaceX's chief operations officer, who had an air of authority about her. She was known for being tough, no-nonsense, and thorough. The team followed her lead as they walked through the various stations at the spaceport, inspecting every aspect of the operation. Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach as Lena approached their station. Lena's piercing gaze seemed to take in every detail, and it made Sarah uneasy. This was the moment when they would either rise to the challenge or falter. "Impressive," Lena said after a long moment of silence, her tone unreadable. Sarah's heart pounded. Was it praise? Or was it a hint of criticism? "We've been working tirelessly to make sure everything is in order," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We've optimized every section of the operation to ensure that we meet all deadlines." Lena nodded, but Sarah couldn't tell if the acknowledgement was a good sign. She watched as Lena and her team moved to the next station, taking meticulous notes. The tension was thick, and every passing minute felt like an eternity. Hours later, the inspection was over. The team gathered in the conference room for a debriefing. Sarah, Mark, and David sat in front of Lena and the rest of the team, waiting for the verdict. Lena was the first to speak. "Your team has shown a great deal of promise. The operations are running smoothly, and your attention to detail is commendable. However, we did find areas that need improvement. There are some time management issues that need to be addressed, and a few adjustments need to be made to the logistics plan." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Time management. They had known this was coming, but hearing it from SpaceX made it feel more real. "We'll fix these issues immediately," Mark said, his voice tight. "We'll have a revised plan ready within the week." Lena nodded, her expression softening slightly. "We believe in your team, but the clock is ticking. You're on the right path, but there's no room for error. We expect nothing less than perfection going forward." As the meeting ended, Sarah's mind was racing. This wasn't over yet, but now, she and her team had a choice to make. Rise to the challenge and prove that they could handle the pressure, or fall short of the standards they had set for themselves. In that moment, Sarah knew one thing for certain. They couldn't afford to fail now. The next few days were a blur of activity as they reworked their plan and tightened every loose end. They had no choice but to make it work. The future of the spaceport expansion and their careers depended on it. Sarah took a deep breath, focused, and got back to work. The next few days felt like an endless whirlwind of meetings, revisions, and sleepless nights. Every moment counted, and the pressure was heavier than ever. Sarah, Mark, and David worked tirelessly, analyzing each detail of their plan and refining every aspect of the operations. They had one chance to get it right. There were no do-overs, no second chances. If they wanted to prove that they belonged in the big leagues with SpaceX, they had to deliver. The clock was ticking, and Sarah's anxiety grew with every passing minute. Every time she glanced at her phone, she felt a jolt of fear. They had only a few days left to submit their revised plan before SpaceX would give their final verdict. She knew that Lena Carlson and the inspection team weren't just looking for good enough. They were looking for perfection. It was a high-stakes game, and the pressure had begun to feel suffocating. Sarah met with Mark and David early one morning. They had gathered all their notes, created an updated timeline, and fine-tuned every detail. Sarah took a deep breath as she looked at the charts and documents laid out in front of her. "This is it," she said, her voice tense. "We're as ready as we're ever going to be, but we can't afford to miss anything. Lena is tough, and she won't hesitate to point out any flaws. We have to be perfect." Mark nodded. "We've reviewed everything. We've improved the time management issues, and we've made adjustments to the logistics. This is our best shot." David, who had been quiet for most of their discussion, finally spoke up. "We've come a long way from where we started. We've learned so much. This is bigger than any of us. But we've earned this, and we're not going to let it slip away." Sarah's heart swelled with pride. David was right. They had fought tooth and nail to get here. They had faced unimaginable challenges, but they had never backed down. Now, it was time to show the world that they had what it took to work with one of the most innovative companies in the world. As the day of the final inspection approached, they spent every waking hour reviewing their work, preparing for the inevitable tough questions, and mentally rehearsing how they would handle any last-minute surprises. It was exhausting, but they knew there was no other option. They were in this for the long haul, and nothing was going to stop them. The day of the inspection arrived. Sarah's stomach was a ball of nerves, but she didn't let it show. She wore her best professional face as she met Lena and the inspection team once more. The air was thick with anticipation, and Sarah could sense the weight of their expectations. They had put in the work, but now it was time to prove themselves. Lena led the team through the operations center once more. The SpaceX team walked briskly, eyes sharp as they scrutinized every corner. Sarah kept her nerves in check, maintaining a calm and composed exterior. She kept her team close, knowing that they would have to face whatever came next as a united front. "Everything seems to be in order," Lena remarked after a thorough walkthrough of the spaceport operations. "Your adjustments have been made, and I can see that the logistics issues are under control." Sarah nodded. "We've worked hard to improve time management and ensure that every part of the project is on schedule." Lena's gaze met hers, unwavering and calculated. "And I can see that. But now comes the real test. You've shown that you're capable of the technical aspects, but there's more to this than just the numbers. We need to see that you can handle the pressure in real time." Sarah felt her heart race. Lena wasn't just testing the plan anymore. She was testing their ability to perform under pressure. It was a crucial moment. The test was no longer about theory. It was about their ability to execute when everything was on the line. "You'll need to demonstrate your team's efficiency today," Lena continued. "We'll simulate an emergency situation. Your ability to respond quickly and effectively will determine whether you're ready to move forward with us." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah's mind immediately began calculating the possibilities. An emergency simulation wasn't just a test of their operational abilities. It was a test of their teamwork, their ability to stay calm under pressure, and their capacity to solve problems in real time. "Understood," Sarah replied, her voice firm. "We're ready." They immediately went into action. The emergency scenario involved a simulated equipment failure at a key facility within the spaceport. The malfunction triggered a communication breakdown, causing delays to a crucial launch window. The team was given 30 minutes to fix the issue, clear the backlog, and get the operations back on track. Sarah's heart pounded as she saw the simulation begin. The timer on the wall started ticking down, and the room seemed to shrink with each passing second. Mark and David immediately sprang into action, coordinating with different departments and organizing teams to tackle the problem. Sarah monitored the situation from the operations center, keeping a close eye on the progress and analyzing the efficiency of their responses. Every decision had to be made with precision. There was no room for error. Minutes ticked by, and the tension in the room rose. Sarah could hear her heartbeat thumping in her ears. She held her breath as Mark communicated with the logistics team, ensuring that they got the equipment back online in time. David was working with the technical crew, troubleshooting the communication breakdown and ensuring they could restore contact with the launch control team. With just 10 minutes left, the team managed to fix the equipment failure, re-establish communications, and clear the backlog. They were on track to meet the launch window. The pressure had been immense, but they had pulled it off. When the simulation finally ended, the room fell silent. Lena stood at the front of the room, her expression unreadable as she observed their performance. "You've handled that well," Lena said, nodding slowly. "It was far from perfect, but you've demonstrated the critical thinking and teamwork necessary for this job. You kept calm, you worked quickly, and most importantly, you worked together. That's what matters in this line of work." Sarah exhaled, relief flooding through her. They had passed the test, not with perfection, but with the kind of real-world response that mattered. Lena's eyes softened slightly. "We'll move forward with your team. The collaboration between SpaceX and your group will begin in earnest. I believe you're ready for what comes next." Sarah's heart soared. They had done it. They had proven themselves. As the days after the inspection passed, the reality of their success began to sink in. The pressure they had been under now seemed like a distant memory, and in its place was the undeniable feeling of accomplishment. They had faced challenges, doubts, and obstacles that had seemed insurmountable. But now, they were part of something far bigger than any of them could have dreamed. For Sarah, the journey was just beginning. The lessons she had learned over the past few months were invaluable. She had faced failure, embarrassment, and fear, but she had emerged stronger than ever. The future of the spaceport expansion was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Sarah and her team were ready to take on whatever came next. And as the first collaboration projects with SpaceX got underway, Sarah knew that this was only the beginning. The sky was no longer the limit. It was just the beginning of their journey. As the days turned into weeks, the excitement surrounding the SpaceX project only intensified. Sarah, Mark, and David had proven themselves, but now they had to prove they could sustain their performance under increasingly difficult circumstances. The stakes had never been higher, and the pressure was palpable. Sarah had always believed that hard work and dedication were the keys to success, but she was quickly learning that to survive in the world of space exploration, it took much more. She had always prided herself on her meticulous planning and problem-solving skills, but now she was being pushed beyond her limits. The tasks at hand were unlike anything she had faced before. They were no longer just managing logistics for an airport. They were overseeing the operations for a spaceport that would eventually launch people and rockets into space. The scope of it was massive, and every decision they made rippled out to affect 1,000 others. Sarah sat in her office late one evening, staring at the plans laid out in front of her. She was deep in thought, trying to wrap her mind around the next phase of the project. The plan was to increase the capacity of the spaceport and add more infrastructure, including additional launch pads and fueling stations. The construction had already begun, but the timeline was growing shorter by the day. They were on track to meet deadlines, but Sarah could already feel the tightness in her chest, the creeping anxiety that seemed to shadow every decision they made. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Mark, his face lined with concern. "We've got a problem," he said, stepping into the office. His tone was serious. This wasn't something they could just brush off. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, sitting up straight. "It's about the fuel storage tanks," Mark replied, his voice strained. "We're behind schedule on the installation. The delivery of the necessary components has been delayed, and it's going to affect our ability to meet the timeline for the launch pad completion." Sarah's stomach dropped. Fuel storage tanks were an integral part of the spaceport's infrastructure, and the delay meant that they wouldn't be able to test the new launch pads as planned. That could potentially set back their entire operation. "How long of a delay are we talking about?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her composure. "At least 2 weeks," Mark said. If we don't fix this now, we risk missing the launch window for the upcoming test flight. This could jeopardize everything we've worked for." Sarah ran her fingers through her hair, trying to process the enormity of the situation. They had no time to waste. A delay of even a few weeks could have a ripple effect on the entire project. "We need to find a solution," Sarah said, her voice firm. "There's no room for errors. We'll have to work around the delay somehow." Mark nodded, but there was little hope in his expression. "We've already contacted every supplier and contractor. No one can expedite the delivery. The only option we have left is to make some adjustments to our testing schedule. We could delay the test flight, but we'd be risking the entire project." Sarah stared at the plans before her, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. If they delayed the test flight, it would send a signal that they couldn't meet their commitments. SpaceX would question their ability to deliver on time, and it could potentially harm their reputation with the company. But if they didn't adjust their schedule, they could run into serious logistical issues that might have even bigger consequences. It felt like a no-win situation. "I need to think," Sarah said, standing up and pacing the room. She needed to clear her head, to find a way through this. Mark remained silent for a moment before speaking again. "I know you've been under a lot of pressure, Sarah, but we're all in this together. We've overcome obstacles before, and we'll do it again. But we need a plan, and we need it now." Sarah nodded, taking a deep breath. "Let's go back to the drawing board. We'll get creative. If we have to push the test flight back, we'll make sure the delay doesn't affect the overall project timeline. But we can't make it obvious. SpaceX can't know we're struggling." Mark's eyes widened slightly. "You're thinking of hiding the delay?" Sarah met his gaze, her eyes steady. "Not hiding it, managing it. We need to think outside the box. We can reallocate resources to different areas, increase the speed of other operations, and push forward with some non-essential tasks that don't rely on the fueling stations. If we act fast and strategically, we can make up for the delay without anyone noticing." David, who had been standing quietly at the door, finally spoke up. "That could work. If we divert focus to other parts of the project that are unaffected, it will give us breathing room. We can also bring in additional teams to handle other tasks, so we don't fall behind on everything." Sarah paused, considering the idea. It was risky, but it just might work. They couldn't afford to sit on their hands and wait for the situation to resolve itself. "All right," she said finally. "We'll divide the team into two groups. One to push forward on areas that are unaffected by the delay, and the other to address the fueling issue as quickly as possible. Mark, you'll oversee the first team. David, you're in charge of the second team. We're going to make this happen." Mark and David nodded in agreement. "Got it," they both said simultaneously. Sarah quickly pulled out a new timeline, detailing how they could reallocate resources, adjust the schedule, and reassign tasks to avoid falling behind on the project's overall goals. She spent the next few hours making phone calls, reaching out to contractors, and updating stakeholders. She was juggling a dozen things at once, but it was the only way to make sure the project kept moving forward. The next 2 weeks were an exhausting blur of activity. Every moment of Sarah's day was consumed by trying to find solutions to the countless obstacles that arose. There were moments of panic, moments when it felt like everything was slipping out of control, but Sarah's team never wavered. They were committed to making the project a success, and they were willing to sacrifice everything to get there. Despite the constant pressure, Sarah began to see progress. The teams were moving efficiently, making adjustments and handling the unexpected delays with professionalism. The spaceport's infrastructure continued to grow, and they managed to push forward on the non-fuel-related projects without anyone noticing the delay. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they were in the clear. The fueling station components arrived, and the construction teams were able to install the storage tanks just in time to test the new launch pads before the scheduled flight. It had been a tightrope walk, but they had pulled it off. As the test flight day arrived, Sarah stood in front of the launch pad, her heart in her throat. The crew was ready, the fueling system was operational, and the launch was set. She watched as the rocket began to slowly ascend into the sky, a symbol of all their hard work. Sarah exhaled slowly, her chest loosening. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was a success, and that was enough. She turned to Mark and David, who were standing beside her, eyes glued to the rocket's trajectory. "We did it," she said quietly. They both smiled, a sense of pride evident on their faces. "We did," Mark replied. "It's only just beginning," David added, his voice full of determination. Sarah smiled. The road ahead would undoubtedly be full of new challenges, but they were ready. Together, they had overcome the impossible. And that was just the start. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The weeks following the successful test flight passed by in a blur. The excitement around the project reached a fever pitch, and the pressure to maintain the momentum was starting to take its toll on Sarah and her team. They had managed to meet critical deadlines, solve complex problems, and impress the SpaceX team with their ability to adapt and overcome. But as the project continued to grow, Sarah realized that there was one thing she hadn't been prepared for: the weight of expectations. Sarah's office had become a war room of sorts. Charts, schedules, and flowcharts covered every available inch of wall space, all meticulously laid out and color-coded. She lived by the plan, ensuring every task was accounted for. But even as she crossed off item after item, it felt like the list of challenges never got any shorter. Sarah rubbed her eyes, the exhaustion evident in the bags beneath them. It had been another late night, another round of revisions to the expansion plans. She needed a break, but there was no time. The next phase of the spaceport expansion was crucial. Everything from additional launch pads to safety systems needed to be implemented before the next series of test flights. Her phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Mark. "Hey, Sarah, you need to see this." Mark's voice sounded unusually tense on the other end. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, straightening in her chair, her heart immediately picking up speed. Mark's voice never wavered unless it was something serious. "I can't explain it over the phone. Get here ASAP." The urgency in his tone sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Something was wrong. She quickly grabbed her bag and headed for the door, her mind racing with possibilities. Was it a technical issue with the spaceport infrastructure? Another delay? A problem with the fueling system? When she arrived at the operations center, the tension in the room was palpable. Mark was standing by the large operations board, staring at a series of numbers on the screen. David stood next to him, equally grim. "What happened?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with worry. David turned to her with a look she couldn't quite read. "We've just received a warning from SpaceX headquarters." Sarah's stomach clenched. SpaceX was a partner, but they were also the ones driving the project forward. If they had concerns, it could mean serious trouble. Mark pointed to the board, where the numbers seemed to be fluctuating wildly. "We've had an issue with the tracking system. The spaceport's GPS and communication feeds are showing discrepancies that shouldn't be there. And there's something else." "What's that?" Sarah asked, leaning in closer. Mark paused before speaking, his voice low. "We think someone's tampering with our systems." Sarah's blood ran cold. Sabotage? The idea was unfathomable. She had never once considered the possibility that someone would deliberately interfere with the spaceport's operations. "Tampering," she repeated, almost disbelieving. "Are you sure?" David nodded gravely. "We've traced the anomalies to a series of signals that don't match anything in our database. They seem to be coming from within the perimeter of the spaceport. The encrypted communications don't line up with any authorized access points. This could be someone working inside the operation." Sarah's mind raced. An inside job? The idea seemed impossible, but it was the only explanation that made sense. If someone had infiltrated their system, it could compromise everything they'd worked for: the test flights, the new facilities, their partnership with SpaceX. All of it was at risk. "We can't waste time. We need to lock down the system and identify where this breach is coming from," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the growing panic in her chest. "Mark, start an audit of all communications and access points. David, check with security. This could be a physical breach as well. We need to find out who's responsible." Both men nodded and immediately got to work. Sarah stayed behind, staring at the fluctuating data on the screen, trying to make sense of it. Her mind was spinning, but she couldn't let it distract her. If there was one thing Sarah had learned in the past few months, It was that panic didn't solve problems. Action did. Minutes later, David returned, looking more troubled than ever. "We've found something," he said. One of the new hires, someone who's been working in communications, was flagged for unusual activity. They've been accessing restricted files related to the launch schedule. And, even worse, they've been sending out encrypted messages. I don't know who they've been in contact with, but it's not looking good. Sarah's heart sank. The fact that they had identified a suspect was a small comfort, but the reality was far worse than she'd imagined. Someone inside their organization was actively working against them. "We need to confront them," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice from trembling. "This is a matter of security. We can't let this go any further." David looked conflicted. "I agree, but we don't have enough evidence to accuse anyone outright. We need to be careful with how we handle this." Sarah nodded, her mind already racing with possible scenarios. If they confronted the suspect too soon, it could backfire. But if they didn't act quickly enough, they risked the possibility of even more sabotage. She didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear. Someone was trying to destroy everything they had worked for, and she couldn't let that happen. The next few hours were a blur of tense meetings, data analysis, and surveillance footage. They worked relentlessly, piecing together every fragment of evidence they could find. Sarah's hands shook as she sifted through the files, her mind working overtime to make connections. It felt like she was racing against an invisible clock, and the weight of everything on her shoulders was suffocating. By the time the team identified the individual in question, a man named Luke Dawson, it was already late into the night. Luke had only been with the project for a few months, but his access to critical communication systems had been frequent and wide-ranging. Sarah called for a meeting with Mark, David, and the head of security, a man named Raphael, to discuss their next steps. They gathered in the small conference room, the tension so thick that it felt like the air was electric. "We've tracked Luke's activities," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "He's been accessing restricted files for weeks, and his encrypted messages have been sent to unknown recipients. We need to act now, but we have to be smart about this." Raphael nodded. "I'll initiate a discreet security sweep. We'll bring Luke in quietly. He won't even know we're on to him." Mark raised a concerned brow. "What if we confront him too early? We might spook him into covering his tracks or, worse, alerting whoever he's working with." "That's why we need to be careful," Sarah said, her tone hardening. "We need to gather enough evidence to make sure that we have the leverage to take him down without fail." As the night wore on, the team set up a plan to monitor Luke's every move. They would follow him discreetly, watch for any signs of further sabotage, and ensure that they had all the pieces before making their move. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. It was hard to believe that someone within their organization was behind this. Luke had always seemed like a quiet, hard-working guy. Nothing about him had stood out as suspicious. Yet, now that the pieces were falling into place, it seemed clear. The threat was closer than anyone had imagined. The next day, after hours of surveillance, they had the evidence they needed. Luke had been in contact with someone outside of the project, someone with a history of working in corporate espionage. His motives became clearer. They were trying to sabotage the spaceport expansion to benefit a rival company. Sarah felt the sting of betrayal in her gut. They had all been so focused on the challenges ahead that they had failed to see the dangers lurking within. But there was no time to dwell on it. They had to stop Luke before he could do any more damage. The following morning, the spaceport operations room was alive with activity, but there was an underlying tension in the air. Sarah had just received confirmation from Raphael that the surveillance had pinpointed Luke's involvement in the sabotage, and now the moment of truth was upon them. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. Sarah stood by the window, watching the early morning sunlight cast long shadows across the launch pads outside. The spaceport seemed peaceful at the moment, almost serene. But beneath that calm surface, chaos was bubbling. Luke Dawson had been a quiet, unassuming presence among the team. But now he was the center of a storm that threatened to derail everything they had worked for. Mark and David were already at the table, discussing the final details of their plan. They had already informed the security team, and they were ready to take action. The goal was to apprehend Luke without causing a scene. keeping the operation as quiet and controlled as possible. Sarah cleared her throat. Are we ready? Her voice, usually steady, betrayed a hint of anxiety. She knew they had no other choice but to confront Luke now, but the fear of what could unfold next lingered in her mind. Mark looked at her with resolve. It's time. We've got everything we need. Raphael's team is in position, and we've already locked down the main comms. We'll move quickly. David leaned forward, his face serious. Once we bring him in, we'll get everything out of him. We can't let him leave until we know who else is involved and what his exact motives are. Sarah nodded, her mind racing. She had always been a planner, preferring to avoid surprises, but now there was no blueprint to follow. This was uncharted territory. The surveillance team had tracked Luke to a secluded corner of the spaceport where he often went during his breaks, an old storage building that had long since been abandoned. It was the perfect spot for their first move. If Luke had been communicating with anyone from the outside, it was likely happening there. Sarah and her team followed the carefully crafted plan to perfection. They approached the building from different angles, ensuring that Luke wouldn't be able to escape or alert anyone before they could reach him. The team moved in silence, communicating only through hand signals and subtle gestures. Every second counted. Raphael, the head of security, was the first to arrive at the entrance, signaling to Mark and David that they were in position. The air was thick with tension as they waited for the signal. When the time came, Raphael stepped into the room, and with a sharp, commanding voice, he said, "Luke Dawson, you're under investigation for corporate espionage and sabotage. Come with us." Luke's reaction was immediate. He froze, his body going rigid as his eyes darted around the room, searching for a way out. But there was no escape. The team had already locked the exits, and he was cornered. "You can't do this," Luke's voice was shaky, but there was a glimmer of defiance in his eyes. "I haven't done anything wrong." Raphael moved toward him, his expression firm but not cruel. "We have the evidence. You've been accessing restricted files, sending encrypted messages to an unknown contact. We know what you've been doing, Luke." Luke swallowed hard, his face pale. "You don't know anything. This is a mistake," he muttered, his eyes shifting nervously. Mark stepped forward, his face hardening. "The only mistake here is thinking you could get away with this. You've been sabotaging our systems to benefit a competitor. You've been in contact with someone who's been trying to bring this spaceport down." Luke looked as if he were about to argue, but the words caught in his throat. He turned away, clearly trying to gather himself, but it was too late. They had him. He was trapped. "We need to know everything," Sarah said, her voice cold and authoritative. "Who are you working for, and why are you doing this? If you cooperate, we can work something out." Luke's lips trembled, his eyes darting around the room, as if searching for a way out, but there was nowhere to go. He sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he whispered, almost to himself. "I was just trying to get by. They offered me a lot of money, more than you could ever imagine." "Who?" Mark pressed, stepping closer to Luke. "Who offered you money? Who are you working for?" Luke hesitated for a long moment, his gaze flickering between Sarah and the rest of the team. The weight of his decision hung in the air, the choice between betraying his employers or facing the consequences of his actions. Finally, he spoke. "It was Aerospace Dynamics," Luke said, his voice shaking with the confession. "They've been trying to get their hands on our designs for months. They offered me a promotion, a big salary increase, but only if I could provide them with critical information about the spaceport's operations. I didn't think it would go this far, but they pushed me. They said if I didn't deliver, they would ruin me." Sarah's mind raced as the pieces started to fall into place. Aerospace Dynamics had been a competitor for years, but they had been kept at bay by the success of SpaceX and their own spaceport. Now, it seemed they were resorting to dirty tactics, trying to destabilize the entire project by any means necessary. "You were willing to sabotage everything we've worked for just for money?" David asked, disbelief clear in his voice. Luke didn't meet his gaze. "I didn't see any other way out. I was desperate." Sarah took a deep breath, her frustration simmering. Aerospace Dynamics had crossed a line, one they wouldn't be able to return from. And now, thanks to Luke's betrayal, They had the evidence they needed to take them down. But it didn't stop the feeling of betrayal that gnawed at her. "We're not done here," Sarah said, her voice steady. "You're going to cooperate with us fully, or we will make sure this goes public. I won't let you drag us down with your mess." Luke nodded, his shoulders slumping further. He knew he had no choice. He was trapped. The next several hours were filled with a whirlwind of activity as the team worked to uncover all the connections between Luke, Aerospace Dynamics, and the sabotage efforts. They combed through his messages, tracked his communications, and pieced together every scrap of information they could find. With each passing minute, they got closer to the core of the conspiracy. Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. Aerospace Dynamics was a formidable company, and their attempt to infiltrate their project meant that they would stop at nothing to gain an advantage. But what they hadn't counted on was Sarah's unwavering resolve. She wasn't about to let anyone, no matter how powerful, destroy everything she had worked for. "This ends now," Sarah said quietly, her gaze hardening. "We'll expose them for what they are." The following days after Luke's confession felt like a whirlwind. Sarah, Mark, and the rest of the team worked tirelessly, but their minds were already racing ahead, thinking about the next move. They knew that the clock was ticking, and Aerospace Dynamics had to be stopped before they could do any more damage. Luke had given them the names of several key people at Aerospace Dynamics who had orchestrated the sabotage, but it wasn't enough. They needed concrete evidence to take down the company. If they were going to expose Aerospace Dynamics, they had to strike at the heart of the operation, the top executives who had been behind the entire scheme. Sarah stood in the middle of the operations room, looking at the massive display screen in front of her. The launch pad was quiet for now, but there was an uneasy tension in the air. The team had been working nonstop, gathering intelligence, tracing communication logs, and compiling a mountain of evidence. "We've got a problem," Mark said, walking over to Sarah with a grim expression. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, her gaze not leaving the screen. She could feel the anxiety building up in her chest. "It's Aerospace Dynamics. They're on to us," Mark said, holding up his tablet. The screen showed an encrypted message that had been intercepted, one that was meant for someone in a high position within their company. Sarah frowned, her thoughts racing. "What does it say?" Mark's voice dropped to a whisper. "It's a warning. They know we're closing in on them, and they're preparing to make their move. We can't afford to wait any longer." Sarah's hands gripped the edge of the table, her mind working overtime. They had to act fast. Aerospace Dynamics was not going to go down without a fight. They had played dirty before, and they would do it again. "We have to outsmart them," Sarah said, her voice low but determined. "We need to strike first. Let's take the fight to them." The next morning, the team gathered in the operations room. Raphael's team had done a thorough job of monitoring Luke's communications, and they had confirmed that the sabotage was only the beginning. Aerospace Dynamics had been pulling strings behind the scenes, and they were preparing for something far more sinister, an attempt to hijack the next SpaceX launch, which would be their chance to destroy the entire project. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she looked over the plans they had created. She knew they couldn't just confront Aerospace Dynamics head-on. The company was too powerful, and they had too many resources at their disposal. But they did have one advantage, the element of surprise. "We'll leak the information to the press," Sarah said, her tone unwavering. "We'll make Aerospace Dynamics look like the villain they are before they have a chance to react." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You want to go public with everything? That's risky. If we expose too much, they'll come after us with everything they've got." "I know," Sarah replied, her gaze steady, "but we have to make them feel the pressure. If we wait any longer, we risk losing everything. We'll expose their dirty tactics, show the world what they've been doing to destroy us." David, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. "We've already got most of the pieces. We just need to put them together and make sure it's airtight." Sarah nodded. "Exactly. If we move fast enough, they won't have time to cover their tracks." The team worked around the clock, preparing for the leak. They gathered everything: Luke's confession, the communications intercepts, the documents that proved Aerospace Dynamics' involvement in the sabotage. They even had footage from the security cameras that showed suspicious activity in the restricted areas of the spaceport. It was a mountain of evidence, and it was all going to be released at once. Sarah sat at her desk, her fingers moving rapidly over her keyboard as she typed up the final pieces of the report. Her mind was sharp, focused. She couldn't afford any mistakes. Every word had to be perfect, every detail had to be in place. This was their moment. "You ready?" Mark asked, standing in the doorway. He was dressed in his usual attire, casual but professional. His eyes were tired, but there was a fire in them. He knew what was at stake, just like Sarah. Sarah didn't look up, but nodded. "Almost. I just need to send the final draft to the reporters. Once it's out there, there's no turning back." Mark stepped closer, his voice softer now. "You're sure about this? Once it goes public, Aerospace Dynamics will fight back. They'll come at us with everything they've got." Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She'd known this was coming. She'd known that going public would make them a target, but she also knew that they had no other choice. Aerospace Dynamics needed to be stopped, and they needed to be stopped now. "I'm sure," Sarah said, her voice filled with determination. "Let's end this." Sarah hit send, and the message was out. The story was officially live, the exposé that would change everything. It was a meticulously crafted piece, laying out all the evidence they had gathered over the past several weeks. It painted a damning picture of Aerospace Dynamics, detailing their attempts to sabotage the spaceport and their involvement in corporate espionage. The story included interviews with whistleblowers, including Luke's confession, and highlighted the company's nefarious tactics. Within minutes, the story began to spread like wildfire. News outlets, social media accounts, and even SpaceX's official channels began to pick it up. The world now knew the truth. Sarah watched as the headlines flashed across her screen: Aerospace Dynamics exposed in corporate espionage scandal, spaceport sabotage, the inside story, and SpaceX spaceport under attack by industry rival. It was everywhere. Their voices had been heard. But even as the world was turning against Aerospace Dynamics, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't won yet. The battle had only just begun. The company would fight back, hard. As if on cue, Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a message from Raphael. "They're coming for us. They know we've gone public." Sarah's heart raced. The retaliation had begun. "This isn't over," Sarah muttered under her breath. "Not by a long shot." Sarah didn't need to look at the message for long to understand the gravity of the situation. Aerospace Dynamics had always been a powerful player in the industry, but now they were fighting for survival. And when cornered, a predator could be more dangerous than ever. The moment the exposé went live, the phone lines began to buzz with frantic calls from every direction. Media outlets seeking comments, internal teams preparing for the fallout, and, of course, the security team monitoring every potential threat. Aerospace Dynamics was reacting swiftly, and Sarah knew they weren't going to go down without a brutal fight. "What's the situation?" Sarah asked, standing from her desk and facing Mark and David, who were both pacing back and forth in the operations room. "They're circling," Mark said grimly. "I've just been briefed. Aerospace Dynamics is mobilizing their legal team, and they've already filed for an injunction to stop the distribution of the report. They're claiming it's defamation." Sarah clenched her jaw. It was a standard tactic, but it didn't mean they were out of danger. Aerospace Dynamics had the resources to drag things out for months if they wanted to. David stepped forward. "They're not just going after the media, they've already targeted our investors. Some of the big names are backing out. They're trying to discredit us in every way possible." Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't afford to lose the trust of the investors now. This wasn't just about exposing Aerospace Dynamics anymore. It was about keeping the entire spaceport project alive. "We need to act fast," she said, taking control of the room. "We can't let them buy time or regain control of the narrative. Mark, get on the phone with the legal team. We'll need to fight this injunction and protect the integrity of the report." Mark nodded and immediately dialed the number. David, meanwhile, continued to monitor the financial fallout, contacting the investors directly to keep them on board. As Sarah stood there, her thoughts began to turn inward. What would Aerospace Dynamics do next? Their retaliation had just begun, but it would likely escalate. She had dealt with corporate battles before, but this felt like a war. If they didn't handle things carefully, it could not only threaten the spaceport but everything they had built. That afternoon, things took a more sinister turn. Raphael, who had been closely monitoring the security feeds, called Sarah into his office. He looked grim. "I've just received an alert," he said, showing her a screen with a live feed of the outer perimeter of the spaceport. "There are unknown vehicles approaching the restricted area. We don't know if they're affiliated with Aerospace Dynamics or if it's something else, but this is escalating fast." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "How many?" "2 trucks and a few motorcycles," Raphael answered. "They're acting suspicious. I've already alerted the local authorities, but we need to be prepared for whatever comes next." Sarah nodded, her mind quickly shifting gears. This was no longer just a corporate battle. It was becoming something much more dangerous. "Keep me updated. I'll be in the command center," she said, her voice steady. "And make sure all critical systems are locked down. If these people try anything, we can't afford any mistakes." By the time Sarah reached the command center, the atmosphere had shifted from tense to downright ominous. The team was on high alert, and the sense of unease in the air was palpable. "Raphael says they're closing in," David reported, his voice tight. "We're not sure what their intentions are yet, but we're taking no chances. I've alerted the emergency response team, and we have additional security on standby." Sarah walked over to the main control panel, her mind calculating her next move. The trucks were getting closer, and the authorities hadn't arrived yet. If this was a coordinated effort from Aerospace Dynamics, they were about to make their next move, a move to intimidate, or worse, sabotage the spaceport. She didn't have time to wait for the authorities. "Activate the security lockdown," she said firmly, making the call herself. The automated lockdown protocols activated, locking all entryways and restricting access to sensitive areas. The team in the control room worked quickly to ensure all critical operations were secured. "We have to assume they're coming for our data," Sarah said, her eyes sharp. "They'll try to get to our servers, or even sabotage the launch system. We can't let them have access." Just as she finished speaking, an alarm blared from the system. "Intruders detected at the south entrance." Her heart raced. "Activate countermeasures. We're not going to let them breach the facility." Seconds later, Sarah watched as the feed from the south entrance showed the intruders' vehicles pulling up. The trucks were parked, and men dressed in tactical gear began to unload. There was no doubt anymore. This wasn't just a corporate dispute. Aerospace Dynamics was making a clear statement. "They've come prepared," Mark said, his voice cold with realization. "We're dealing with more than just lawyers and boardroom tactics now." Sarah's pulse quickened, but she fought to maintain her composure. There was no room for fear now. They had to hold their ground. She gestured to the team. "Raphael, take a team and secure the perimeter," she said. "Everyone else, monitor the security feeds. We need eyes on everything." The team moved quickly, their movements precise as they carried out their orders. Raphael and his team had always been well trained for these kinds of situations, but this was different. The risk was too great to take chances. As the tension mounted, Sarah received a call from the outside. It was a private line. She picked up the phone, her throat tight. "Hello?" "Sarah," a deep voice said, the tone heavy with urgency. It was Travis Campbell, the CEO of Aerospace Dynamics. She had expected a confrontation, but hearing his voice now sent a chill down her spine. "What do you want?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Let's be clear here," Travis said, his words cutting through the phone. "This is bigger than you think. You don't know who you're messing with. If you don't step back, if you don't drop this crusade of yours, you're going to regret it." Sarah took a deep breath, not backing down. "It's already too late, Travis. The truth is out there now, and no matter what you do, the world is watching. You won't get away with this." Travis's laughter came through the phone, bitter and mocking. "You don't get it, do you? The game has just begun." Sarah hung up the phone, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just a fight for the spaceport. It was a battle for everything they had worked for, everything she believed in. "Let's show them we're not backing down," she said to her team, her voice unyielding. "We're going to finish this, once and for all." The hours following the call with Travis Campbell were tense, filled with anticipation. Sarah's mind was sharp and clear, but her heart beat fast with the realization that the situation was rapidly escalating beyond anyone's control. The intruders were closing in on the south entrance, and there was no way of knowing what they had planned next. Raphael had gathered his team of security professionals and was strategically positioning them along the perimeter of the spaceport. They had trained for scenarios like this, but nothing could have prepared them for an attack from a corporate giant willing to throw everything at them. Sarah watched the monitors as the intruders spread out, trying to flank the security posts. "What are they after?" Mark asked, his brow furrowed as he watched the footage on the screen. "They don't look like typical robbers." "They've come for our data," Sarah said, the certainty in her voice clear. "They want access to the servers, to take everything down. They want to destroy the truth, erase it all before it can reach the public." Mark nodded. "They're not just here to sabotage the launch. They're trying to erase any trace of the evidence." "Exactly." Sarah's gaze never wavered from the screen. She knew they had to protect not just the spaceport, but everything they had worked so hard to expose. It was all on the line now. The minutes felt like hours as the intruders advanced closer to their objective. Raphael's team was doing their best to hold them off, but it was clear that these men weren't just hired thugs. They were highly trained, moving with precision, and they were getting closer to the server room. Sarah's fingers hovered over the buttons in the control room. If they made it into the server room, all their work could be undone in an instant. The evidence, the story, everything would be gone. The world would never know the truth about aerospace dynamics. "We need to act now," Sarah said, her voice low but resolute. "If they breach the server room, it's over." David, who had been monitoring the communication lines, suddenly looked up from his screen. "Sarah, we've got a problem. I've been listening in, and I just intercepted a message. One of their guys is already inside." Sarah's stomach dropped. "What do you mean inside?" "They've got someone in the building already, bypassed our security system somehow," David explained, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "They're in the data center. We need to cut them off." "Where are they now?" Sarah demanded, her pulse quickening. David pointed at the screen. "They're about 200 meters away from the core server room. We've got minutes." With no time to lose, Sarah quickly switched tactics. "Raphael, move your team in. We need to shut down access to the server room before they can steal anything. Lock it down now." Raphael's voice crackled through the intercom. "We're on it." The room seemed to hold its breath as Sarah, Mark, and David all watched the monitors. Every second counted. The countdown was on. Back at the perimeter, Raphael's team was closing in on the intruders, but they still hadn't managed to push them back. There was no doubt that Aerospace Dynamics had prepared for this. Every move they made seemed calculated, and the men they were facing were well-funded, well-trained, and relentless. As the team made their way closer to the server room, Sarah received a communication from Raphael. "We've got trouble," he said urgently. "They've set up a blockade at the west gate. We can't get reinforcements through. Looks like they're trying to trap us inside." Sarah's blood ran cold. The intruders were not just after the data. They were trying to trap them. "Lock down all access points," Sarah ordered. "No one gets in or out. We'll handle this ourselves." Inside the building, tension was at its peak. Sarah and her team knew that time was running out. Every step was a calculated risk, and the more they delayed, the more the intruders gained ground. Mark's voice cut through the silence. "I've got an idea, but it's risky." Sarah turned to him, waiting for him to continue. "We can overload the system," Mark said, his eyes lighting up with a plan. "We set up a decoy signal, a false message that will trigger the server's defenses and lock them out. If we do it right, we can stall them long enough to get reinforcements in." It was a bold move. It could either buy them precious time or backfire and make things worse. Sarah didn't hesitate. "Do it, but make sure it works." As Mark worked feverishly to set up the decoy, Sarah's thoughts raced. They had come so far, too far to fail now. Aerospace Dynamics had thought they could intimidate them into submission, but Sarah had learned long ago that the only way to win was to fight harder than anyone thought you could. Her phone buzzed again. It was another message from Raphael. "They're getting closer to the server room. We have to act now, or we lose everything." It was the moment of truth. Sarah's hand gripped the edge of the desk. This had to work. Mark's fingers flew over the keyboard as he fed in the data that would trigger the decoy. The seconds seemed to stretch out infinitely as everyone held their breath. Finally, Mark hit the enter key. The screen flashed, and a series of warning lights began to blink on the security panel. System overload in progress, the screen read. The decoy had worked. The server systems instantly began locking down, barring the intruders from any access to the core data. For a moment, everything was quiet, an eerie calm. But just as Sarah allowed herself a brief sigh of relief, her phone rang once again. It was Raphael. "We've got another problem," he said, his voice tense. "What now?" Sarah asked, trying to stay focused. "They've breached the main control room from the east entrance. We're being flanked." It was happening. The walls were closing in. Aerospace Dynamics wasn't just trying to steal data anymore. They were trying to take the entire facility. Sarah stood tall, her determination solidifying. There was no way she was going to let them take it, not after everything they had fought for. "Lock down the east entrance," she ordered. "Prepare for a full evacuation if needed, but not yet. We still have a chance to fight this." Mark and David immediately went into action. Security teams moved to intercept the intruders from every possible angle. But Sarah knew that they could only hold off the attack for so long. There was no way they could stop the sheer force of Aerospace Dynamics on their own. "Raphael," Sarah said, her voice steady. "How much longer do we have?" "Minutes," he replied. "The intruders are gaining ground." Sarah turned to Mark, her eyes sharp. "We need to move fast. Get the media involved. If we can't hold them off, we need the world to know what's happening here. Aerospace Dynamics needs to see the whole world watching." Mark nodded. "I'll make the calls. They won't get away with this." The spaceport was now in chaos, but Sarah knew that in the end, they had one advantage, the truth. And with it, they would find a way to take down Aerospace Dynamics once and for all. The situation was slipping out of their control, and Sarah knew that they couldn't afford to wait any longer. The minutes felt like an eternity, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. The decoy Mark had triggered had temporarily halted the intruders' progress, but it wasn't a permanent fix. The decoy was only a brief stall tactic, something to buy them a bit of time, but not enough to turn the tide in their favor. Sarah paced the command center, trying to come up with a strategy. Raphael's team was still engaged in heavy combat at the perimeter. The intruders, now fully aware of the spaceport's defenses, were determined to breach and wreak havoc. They weren't just corporate goons. They were a well-organized force, one that had been preparing for this exact moment. Mark sat at the control panel, working feverishly to coordinate their next moves. "We've got a live feed from the east entrance," he said, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "They're inside the building now. They've breached our defenses." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. "What's our status in the West Wing?" she asked. David, who was monitoring communications, looked up. "They've got units in place there too, but we've got eyes on them. The reinforcements should arrive in 20 minutes. The problem is, we don't know what they've already done. They might have gotten to the power supply or compromised the air ducts." "Right," Sarah muttered, rubbing her temples as the pressure mounted. She couldn't think straight. They were running out of time, and Aerospace Dynamics had already shown they were willing to play dirty. "Can we get in contact with the media?" Sarah asked Mark, turning to him. "I need them to get the story out, make sure everyone knows what's going on. We can't afford to have Aerospace Dynamics spinning this their way. We need to force their hand." Mark looked at her, his brow furrowed. "You think they'll listen to us? We're locked down here." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "We don't have a choice. They need to know that this isn't just a corporate dispute. Aerospace Dynamics is trying to destroy everything we've built, and they need to be held accountable." Mark nodded and began reaching out to his contacts. He knew how to make things happen, but this was unlike anything they'd faced before. Aerospace Dynamics was playing hardball. Meanwhile, at the West Wing, Raphael's security team was engaged in a standoff with the intruders. The spaceport's emergency lockdown had kept the intruders from getting into critical areas, but it had also trapped Raphael's men inside, keeping them at a distance from the more sensitive sections of the building. "We can't hold them back much longer," Raphael's voice crackled over the intercom. "They're too many, and they're getting bolder. We need more firepower, or this is going to turn into a full-blown firefight." Sarah clenched her fists, trying to stay composed. She couldn't lose this battle. She couldn't let the intruders break into their last line of defense, the server room. Without that, everything they had worked for would be lost. Raphael, she said, her voice calm but firm, we need you to do whatever it takes to hold them back. I don't care how. Just get to the server room before they do. Raphael didn't hesitate. Understood. I'll do what I can. Back at the command center, Sarah's eyes were glued to the monitor. The world outside seemed to have disappeared, leaving only the shadows of the intruders moving across the screen, closing in on their final objective. Mark, have you gotten through to anyone yet? Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice even, despite the storm of thoughts swirling in her head. Mark shook his head, frustration clear in his eyes. No one's picking up, or they're going straight to voicemail. They're blocking us out, Sarah. They know what's at stake. The realization hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. Aerospace Dynamics had control of the narrative. They were powerful enough to stifle anyone who might speak up. The media wasn't responding. The investors were silent. And even her own team, her own security, was getting overwhelmed. A call came through to Sarah's personal line, pulling her out of her spiraling thoughts. She quickly answered. Sarah, Travis's voice came through, smooth as ever. I see things aren't going well for you. Sarah's stomach churned. She had been expecting this. Travis Campbell, CEO of Aerospace Dynamics, always had a way of showing up at the most inconvenient times. He had always believed that money and power could fix everything. But this time, his arrogance was going to be his downfall. What do you want, Travis? She asked, keeping her voice steady despite the mounting tension. Travis chuckled, his tone condescending. I think you know exactly what I want. You've made your choice, and now I'm making mine. You've already put the spaceport at risk. The question is, are you ready to take responsibility for the consequences? Sarah's blood ran cold. He was threatening them, but she wasn't going to let him intimidate her, not after everything they had fought for. I'm not afraid of you, Travis, she replied, her voice unwavering. I know exactly what I'm doing. If you think you can break us, you're gravely mistaken. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Travis spoke again, his voice was colder, more dangerous. You'll regret this, he said, before hanging up. Sarah stared at the phone for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Regret? She wasn't going to let him win. Not now, not ever. The countdown was ticking. The reinforcements hadn't arrived yet, and Raphael's team was fighting an uphill battle. But Sarah wasn't about to give in. Get the cameras ready, she said, her voice sharp. We need to send the message, Mark. It's time to take this to the world. Mark nodded, his fingers moving quickly to set up a live stream feed. He understood what Sarah was asking. This was their last chance to get their story out there, to fight back. Within moments, a live feed went live, showing a camera positioned on Sarah as she addressed the world. The tension in her eyes was evident, but so was her determination. Everyone needs to understand what's happening here, she said, looking directly into the camera. Aerospace Dynamics is not just a company. They are a corporate machine, willing to destroy lives and ruin everything we've worked for just to protect their own interests. They'll stop at nothing to silence the truth. But we will not be silenced. We will not be intimidated. This is a fight for the future, for our future. As Sarah spoke, Mark pushed out the feed to news outlets, social media platforms, and anyone who could get the message out. The world had to know the truth about Aerospace Dynamics. Outside the spaceport, the battle was far from over. Inside, Sarah's team continued to hold their ground, but the stakes were higher than ever. The world was watching, and the future of the spaceport, and everything they stood for, was hanging by a thread. As the feed continued to roll, and as reinforcements began to arrive, one thing became clear to Sarah. The battle was far from over, but she was prepared to see it through to the end. The moment the live feed went public, Sarah felt a strange sense of power. The weight of the entire world watching them gave her a renewed strength. For the first time in hours, she wasn't just reacting to what was happening. She was making the world react to her. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Even though the eyes of the world were now on Aerospace Dynamics, their power still loomed large. Their ability to erase anyone who stood in their way was undeniable. And right now, They were actively trying to crush everything Sarah and her team had worked for. As the live stream continued to run, Sarah glanced at the monitors. Mark's face was tense, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes as he worked tirelessly to get the feed out to the media outlets. The impact of what they were doing couldn't be underestimated. People were already starting to take notice. There were social media posts flooding in with hashtags like #SaveTheSpaceport and #AeroSpaceDynamicsExposed. It was a start, but they needed more than just a social media storm. They needed reinforcements, and they needed them fast. Outside the command center, the sounds of distant gunfire and shouting continued to echo through the building. Raphael's team was holding their ground, barely. The intruders had split into multiple units, trying to cover all possible entry points, but Raphael and his men were making it difficult to get past them. The security team was doing everything in their power to delay the breach into the core areas. They knew the consequences of failure. Raphael's voice came through on the intercom again, more urgent this time. "Sarah, we've got a problem. They've sent in a sniper team. We can't move our forces without getting picked off." Sarah's mind raced as she processed the information. A sniper team meant they were trying to pick off their guards one by one, whittling them down until they were vulnerable. It was a brutal tactic, and one she hadn't anticipated. "Can you return fire?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp. "We're outgunned," Raphael replied, his tone grim. "We can hold our positions for a while, but it won't be enough." Sarah's eyes flashed to the security panel. If Raphael's team couldn't hold the line, it wouldn't be long before the intruders got closer to the heart of the spaceport. The server room, the communications center, the very infrastructure they needed to keep this whole operation intact. "Mark, get me a direct line to our backup team," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the growing chaos. "We need to get someone in here to counter the snipers fast." Mark nodded, making the call without hesitation. Meanwhile, Sarah looked back at the monitors. The intruders were getting closer to the server room. The lines of defense were growing thinner, and she could hear the distant crackle of gunfire through the static of the communication channel. Suddenly, an alert popped up on the screen. "The snipers are getting closer," David said, pointing to a live map of the area. "They're taking out guards on the outer perimeter. We don't have much time before they close in on our position." At that moment, the door to the command center swung open, and two security personnel rushed in. Their faces were grim, their uniforms dusty and stained with sweat. It was clear they had been engaged in heavy combat outside, but they had come with good news. "We've got reinforcements coming in," one of them said. "Our backup team has cleared a path through the East Wing. They'll be here in 5 minutes. The sniper team is going to be neutralized." Sarah's heart surged with relief. Finally, some good news. "Get the backup team to the East Corridor and prepare to take out the snipers," she instructed. "We need to regain control before they breach the interior." The two security officers nodded and dashed out of the room, ready to put the plan into motion. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah continued to watch the monitors, her nerves stretched taut. The sniper threat was significant, but with the backup team on the way, there was a glimmer of hope. They just had to hold out long enough for the reinforcements to do their job. The live feed continued to run, showing Sarah's team in action, giving people a front-row seat to the unfolding drama. The more viewers tuned in, the more pressure mounted on aerospace dynamics. It wasn't just about the battle inside the spaceport anymore. It was about the world watching, and that gave Sarah the upper hand. Then, the unmistakable sound of gunfire rang through the air, followed by a burst of static from the intercom. "They're moving in from the south," Raphael's voice crackled. "They're going for the server room. We can't stop them." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment they'd been dreading. The enemy was closing in on the heart of the spaceport, where everything they had worked for could be destroyed in seconds. "Mark, get me the control for the server room," Sarah snapped. "We need to lock it down now." Mark's fingers flew over the keyboard as he worked to activate the lockdown. The lights in the command center flickered momentarily, and the sound of metal doors sealing echoed through the building. The server room was secure, but for how long? "We've got about 5 minutes before they try to break through again," Mark said, his voice tense. "I'm trying to reroute power to the backup systems, but it's going to take time." Sarah closed her eyes for a brief moment, trying to steady her breathing. She wasn't about to lose everything now. She had come too far, fought too hard. "Raphael, listen to me," Sarah said into the intercom. "You need to do everything you can to slow them down. If you have to, get aggressive. We can't let them anywhere near the server room. Do not let them breach it." "We're doing everything we can, Sarah," Raphael replied, his voice strained but determined. "But we're running out of time." Sarah turned to Mark, her mind working in overdrive. They needed an edge, something to throw off the intruders long enough for their team to regroup. "I've got it," Mark said suddenly, a light bulb going off in his mind. "If we trigger the fire suppression system in the hallway, we can block their advance and cause some confusion. It'll buy us at least 10 minutes. Sarah didn't hesitate. "Do it." Mark typed furiously, and within moments, the fire suppression system activated. A loud hiss filled the air as fire-suppressing foam sprayed down the hallway, quickly covering the floors and walls. The intruders would now be disoriented, unable to proceed without slipping in the foam or getting caught in the dense mist. "We've bought some time," Mark said with a sigh of relief. Back in the East Wing, the backup team had reached the sniper's position. They moved with military precision, clearing the area in short order. The sound of gunfire ceased, replaced by the hum of their radios and the distant orders being relayed. "They're neutralized," the lead officer radioed in. "We have full control of the East Wing now." Sarah nodded, her mind racing to the next objective. The tide was turning. It wasn't over yet, but it was clear that they had gained the upper hand. The battle for the spaceport was far from finished, but Sarah now knew one thing for sure. They weren't going down without a fight. The battle for the spaceport raged on, but Sarah could sense something shifting in the air. The reinforcements had arrived, the snipers had been neutralized, and the intruders, while still powerful and relentless, were beginning to feel the pressure. She could feel it in the way they hesitated, in the sudden shift in their tactics. But they weren't out of the woods yet. There were still obstacles to overcome, still enemies to defeat. Sarah paced the command center, her mind working at 1,000,000 miles an hour, trying to predict their next moves. "Mark, give me an update on the live feed," she said, her voice sharp and clear despite the exhaustion creeping in. Mark was already at his station, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "It's going viral, Sarah," he said, not looking up. "Social media is blowing up. #SaveTheSpaceport is trending worldwide. Everyone's watching. Aerospace Dynamics can't hide this anymore." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. This was exactly what they needed. The pressure from the public I was mounting, and it was forcing Aerospace Dynamics into a corner. But public opinion alone wouldn't win this battle. They needed to finish what they had started. "We need to keep the momentum going," Sarah said, turning to David, who had been monitoring communications. "Has anyone from the government or the media reached out yet?" David shook his head, his expression tense. "Not yet. They're all still processing. Aerospace Dynamics has a lot of sway with the higher-ups. We might need to push harder to get their attention." Sarah clenched her jaw. She knew how this worked. Powerful corporations like Aerospace Dynamics could pull strings, influence politicians, and control the narrative. But if they were exposed, if the world knew what was really going on behind the scenes, it would make it harder for them to get away with this. "I'm not waiting," Sarah said, her voice resolute. "We can't wait for them to come to us. We'll take the fight to them. Mark, get me a direct line to every news outlet we can contact. We're going to keep the pressure on. I need every media outlet running this story." Mark didn't hesitate, his hands flying across the keyboard as he set up the communication lines. Sarah's eyes flicked to the monitors, her mind racing. Meanwhile, on the ground, Raphael's team had finally gained some breathing room. The fire suppression system had thrown off the intruders' advance, giving them enough time to regroup. But they weren't in the clear yet. The enemy was still trying to push through the defenses, determined to take the spaceport down at any cost. Raphael's voice crackled over the intercom again. "We're holding steady at the server room entrance, but they're getting more aggressive. They've brought in heavy artillery." Sarah felt a surge of frustration. She had hoped the reinforcements would give them a stronger foothold, but it seemed like the intruders were escalating their efforts. "We need to counter their heavy artillery," Sarah said firmly. "Do we have any backup weapons or defenses that can match their firepower?" Raphael paused for a moment before replying. We've got some heavy-duty lasers and EMP grenades in the armory, but we're still waiting for a safe window to get them into play. Sarah's mind raced. Every minute they waited gave Aerospace Dynamics another chance to break through. The spaceport's defenses were holding for now, but Sarah knew they couldn't afford to rely on luck. Listen, she said, her voice calm but urgent. Get those EMP grenades into play. Disable their artillery. I'll buy you time on my end. As Sarah hung up the intercom, she turned to Mark, her mind already working through the next phase of their plan. Mark, I need you to contact the military. I know we have a few connections left. Tell them we're under siege, and the threat to national security is real. This isn't just a corporate war, it's a full-scale assault. We need their support now. Mark's eyes widened in realization. You're going to escalate this to that level? You know how this could go down. Aerospace Dynamics has a lot of pull with the Pentagon. Sarah's gaze hardened. They don't get to control the narrative anymore. The public is watching, and if we can get the military on our side, Aerospace Dynamics won't be able to make a move without facing consequences. Mark immediately began making calls, reaching out to their military contacts. He worked quickly, speaking in coded language to avoid detection by the intruders. Sarah could see the strain in his eyes as he relayed the information, but he was relentless. He knew this was their best shot at winning. We've got a connection, Mark finally said, relief evident in his voice. I just spoke to General Cross. He's going to send reinforcements our way, but it's going to take at least an hour for them to mobilize. An hour? It felt like a lifetime, but it was better than nothing. Good, Sarah said, nodding. We can hold for an hour. Keep the line open. We'll need them to be ready to move the moment we get their signal. Back in the West Wing, Raphael's team had executed their plan. The EMP grenades had taken out the intruders' artillery, buying them a few more precious minutes. But the enemy wasn't finished. They had begun to regroup, pulling back and reassessing their strategy. This wasn't a simple hostile takeover anymore. It was a fight for control of the future, and both sides were willing to do anything to win. Raphael's voice came through the intercom again. We've got reinforcements moving in. The backup weapons are in place. We've got a chance to push them back. Sarah felt a surge of hope. Do it, she said firmly. Push them back. Keep them away from the server room at all costs. As the sounds of combat continued to echo through the building, Sarah could feel the tension in the air. They were close. The reinforcements were on their way, and the tide was slowly turning in their favor. But it wasn't over yet. Minutes later, a sharp knock on the door interrupted Sarah's thoughts. It was David, looking urgent. Sarah, he said, his voice tense, you need to see this. He handed her a tablet. The screen displayed a breaking news segment. Aerospace Dynamics had made a public statement, and it wasn't good. They were denying everything, calling the siege a malicious hoax, and accusing Sarah and her team of inciting violence. It's a full-on smear campaign, David said, his voice low. They're trying to turn the public against us. Sarah's jaw tightened as she watched the footage. Travis Campbell, the CEO of Aerospace Dynamics, stood in front of a crowd of reporters, speaking with his usual air of superiority. This is nothing more than an attempt to sabotage our progress, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. We're committed to the future, and we won't be deterred by false accusations. Sarah turned off the tablet with a snap, her hands trembling slightly. They were trying to control the narrative again, but this time, Sarah wouldn't let them. She looked at Mark, her resolve hardening. We need to fight back harder. The reinforcements were almost here. The battle was nearing its climax, but Sarah knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about taking down Aerospace Dynamics anymore. It was about proving that their fight was worth it, that their mission had value beyond what anyone, including Travis Campbell, had believed. As the countdown to the final showdown began, one thing was clear. The spaceport's fate rested in their hands. Sarah stood at the command center, her heart pounding in her chest. The reinforcements were on their way, but she couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping through their fingers. Every second that passed felt like a countdown to disaster. Aerospace Dynamics was pulling out all the stops to neutralize them, and despite the momentum they had gained from public exposure, the enemy still had the resources to crush them if they got the chance. Mark, who had been working tirelessly to keep the public's attention on their side, glanced up from his console. His face was strained, but his eyes showed a flicker of hope. We've got movement. The media's coverage is only intensifying. There's no way Aerospace Dynamics can ignore this for much longer. Sarah nodded, but her thoughts remained elsewhere. We need to buy more time, she muttered under her breath. The countdown to reinforcements was close, but it felt like an eternity. Outside, Raphael's team had pushed back the initial wave of intruders, but now the stakes were even higher. The enemy was no longer trying to storm the building. They were playing the long game, trying to find weaknesses, exploiting any small gap in their defense. Raphael had reported that there was a large contingent of heavily armed forces gathered at the eastern perimeter, preparing for another assault. They'll hit hard, Raphael's voice echoed over the comms. We need to make sure we're ready when they do. There's no time for mistakes. Sarah could hear the weight in Raphael's words, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself a moment to process everything. It wasn't just the spaceport anymore. This was a battle for their lives, their futures, and the future of the people they had promised to protect. Don't worry, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty that clouded the air. We'll hold. Trust me. As the minutes passed, the tension grew unbearable. The live feed continued to stream across millions of devices, showcasing their struggle and gaining more traction with every update. But Sarah knew the more their enemies felt cornered, the more dangerous they became. Aerospace Dynamics had never been the type of corporation to simply give up, and Travis Campbell was more dangerous than any of them realized. The door to the command center opened with a sudden creak. Sarah turned, expecting to see one of her officers, but instead, it was Mark, his face pale, his hands shaking. Sarah, we've got a major problem, Mark said, his voice laced with urgency. What happened? She asked, her stomach tightening. He handed her a tablet, and Sarah's heart sank as she looked at the screen. On it, a video was playing, a grainy, shaky footage of an explosion in the eastern wing. The building trembled as smoke poured from the walls, a sign of the intruders pushing forward, using their last-ditch weapons to gain ground. They've breached the perimeter, Mark said quietly, his eyes dark with fear. They're in the building. Sarah felt her pulse spike as she stared at the screen. The explosion wasn't just a sign of a breach. It was a signal that their defenses were being overrun. Raphael, do you read me? Sarah spoke into the intercom, her voice laced with determination. We're on it, came Raphael's immediate response. They've made it past the outer defenses. We're holding them back, but we can't maintain this forever. We need to slow them down, Sarah said, the words barely leaving her lips before a sudden thought struck her. What about the backup security system we designed? The one that had the autonomous drones? Mark's eyes lit up with understanding. Sarah, are you suggesting we activate them? Sarah nodded, her heart racing. It's our only option. Those drones were designed to hold off large-scale attacks. They're autonomous and quick. We activate them, and they'll give us the time we need to regroup. Without waiting for another word, Mark rushed to his station. His fingers danced over the controls, and within seconds, the screens lit up with data. A low hum filled the room as the drones in the outer wings were powered on and activated. Back on the front lines, Raphael could hear the buzz of the drones as they swooped into action, lighting up the perimeter with rapid-fire lasers. Their activation had disrupted the enemy's advance, creating a momentary lull in the chaos. Hold the line, Raphael barked into his comms. We've got drones up. Keep fighting. The drones were a sight to behold, their sleek, angular bodies gliding through the smoke-filled air with precision. They moved in formation, clearing the path ahead of the enemy, firing with precision at any target that attempted to breach the perimeter. But as the minutes ticked away, it was clear that this was only a temporary solution. The drones were powerful, but they couldn't hold off the entire force forever. The attackers were relentless, and each time the drones took down a few, more enemies appeared in their place. Sarah knew they had mere minutes before the situation reached a breaking point. But just as she began to feel the weight of the pressure building up, the doors to the command center burst open once again. This time, it was Raphael himself, his expression a mix of relief and urgency. "Sarah, we've got the cavalry. The military's here. They've made it to the south wing." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she heard the confirmation. The reinforcements had arrived, just in time. But there was no time to celebrate. The final push was coming. "Get them in position. We need to counter the attack from the east," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We can't let them get closer to the server room." Raphael's team moved quickly, rallying the backup forces as the military unit took their place in the spaceport. The enemy was still strong, still attempting to break through, but the tide was beginning to turn. As the sound of military trucks rumbled through the halls, Sarah knew this was it. This was their chance. The military forces, led by General Cross, were precise and coordinated. Within minutes, the heavy artillery began to roar, turning the tide in their favor. Explosions filled the air as Aerospace Dynamics forces scrambled to regroup, but now, they were the ones who were being pushed back. Sarah watched the chaos unfold on the monitors. The drones continued to fight, creating cover for the military forces as they advanced through the corridors. With every passing moment, the situation looked more and more in their favor. The enemy was retreating, but Sarah knew they weren't out of danger yet. "Stay sharp," she said to the team around her. "They'll come back. We need to finish this." Minutes later, the last of the enemy forces surrendered. The once violent battle had shifted in Sarah's favor, but the exhaustion was starting to set in. There was a long silence, broken only by the distant hum of machinery and the fading sound of gunfire. "We did it," Mark said quietly, disbelief in his voice. But Sarah didn't share in his relief. Not yet. They had won this battle, but the war wasn't over. She could already hear the calls for retaliation from Aerospace Dynamics, and she knew they would stop at nothing to regain control. As the sun began to rise over the spaceport, Sarah walked through the now quiet halls, surveying the damage. The spaceport had survived, but it was clear that the fight was far from finished. The story was just beginning, and Sarah was ready to see it through to the end. The spaceport had held, for now. The sound of distant sirens echoed through the air as the sun broke over the horizon. The spaceport, once filled with tension and chaos, was now eerily still. Sarah stood at the entrance of the command center, looking out at the damage. The war wasn't over, but they had won a significant battle. The reinforcements had been crucial in securing the victory, but there was no denying the price they'd paid to get here. Her team, though bruised and exhausted, remained steadfast. Their faces, smeared with sweat and dust, showed signs of the toll the siege had taken, but there was a sense of quiet pride among them. They had done it, but Sarah knew this was only the beginning. Aerospace Dynamics wasn't the type of corporation to go down without a fight. Travis Campbell, the CEO, would be seething, and the public spectacle they'd created would only make things worse. The real battle, the one that would decide their fate, was just beginning. Inside the command center, Sarah gathered her team for a debriefing. The place was chaotic, filled with people running around, assessing damage and securing the building. The military had already started to take control, setting up a perimeter and assisting with the cleanup. But the tension was palpable. "Sarah," Mark said, approaching her as she stood by the large monitor. "The media's picking up the story. We've got every major news outlet covering what happened here today. It's all over social media. But Aerospace Dynamics—" "I know," Sarah interrupted, her voice steady but filled with an undeniable edge. "They're going to try and spin this against us. They always do. But we've got the truth on our side, and it's time we make sure everyone knows it." Mark nodded, clearly understanding the weight of her words. The fight they had fought here today wasn't just about defending the spaceport. It was about exposing the truth. Sarah wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting to take down a corrupt system. Sarah walked through the command center, her thoughts a whirlwind of plans and strategies. She could already sense the next phase of this struggle forming before her eyes. The public was watching, and the media was hungry for more. It was time to keep pushing. The video footage of the siege, showing the heroic stand of her team and the devastating attack on the spaceport, had already gone viral. The hashtag Save the Spaceport was trending worldwide, and people were beginning to rally behind their cause. It was exactly what they needed to keep the pressure on aerospace dynamics. But Sarah knew there was more to do. They had to act fast. Their victory at the spaceport was just a small piece of the puzzle. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, Travis Campbell sat in his luxurious office, his hands steepled in front of his face as he stared out at the city below. His expression was cold, calculating. His empire, once untouchable, had just suffered a major blow, and he wasn't going to let it slide. "This isn't over," he muttered to himself, his voice low but filled with venom. Not by a long shot. He had underestimated Sarah and her team. The attack on the spaceport had been a mistake, a miscalculation in judgment. He had assumed that it would be a quick operation, a way to crush the resistance and take control of the spaceport without much resistance. But what had happened instead was a spectacle that threatened to unravel everything he had worked so hard to build. But Campbell wasn't the type to fold. His company had weathered storms before, and it would do so again. It was time to escalate. Back at the spaceport, Sarah and her team continued to monitor the situation. It wasn't long before the first signs of retaliation started to appear. Aerospace Dynamics wasn't backing down. They were coming for them, and they were coming hard. "Sarah," David said, his voice breaking through the hum of the command center. "We've just gotten word from one of our sources in the military. Aerospace Dynamics is pressuring lawmakers to silence the media. They're trying to bury the truth." Sarah clenched her jaw. This was exactly what she had feared. They had anticipated this move, but hearing it confirmed still made her blood run cold. "They're going to try and manipulate the narrative," Sarah said, her voice laced with determination. "We can't let them." "We've got a chance here, though," David continued. "The public is on our side. The more we push the truth, the harder it'll be for them to suppress it." Sarah nodded, but her mind was already racing. "We need to hit them where it hurts," she said. "If they think they can control the narrative, it's time to show them just how wrong they are. Let's get all the footage we've gathered, everything we've captured. This is going public, no more delays." Meanwhile, on the battlefield, Raphael's team had been busy securing the perimeter and preparing for any future attacks. The spaceport's defenses had been heavily damaged during the siege, but they were still functional. The drones continued to patrol the area, and military forces were setting up checkpoints to prevent further breaches. As Raphael surveyed the area, he spotted one of his team members approaching, a piece of critical intelligence in hand. "Raphael," the soldier said breathlessly, "we've intercepted communications. Aerospace Dynamics is planning another assault. They're mobilizing." Raphael's stomach twisted. He had known it wouldn't end with just one fight. This was far from over. "Where?" Raphael demanded. "The east perimeter," the soldier replied. "It's their point of entry, and they've brought in more firepower this time." Raphael's eyes narrowed. "Prepare for another assault. Get the drones into position, and we'll need to reinforce the eastern defenses. We can't let them break through again." Sarah had barely finished giving orders for the media campaign when an urgent call came through. "Sarah, you need to see this," Mark said, his voice strained with alarm. "Aerospace Dynamics is already trying to spin the media in their favor. They've released a statement claiming we were the ones who initiated the violence. They're calling us terrorists, accusing us of endangering the public." Sarah's fists clenched, but she kept her composure. She had known this was coming. The more they pressed for the truth, the harder Aerospace Dynamics would fight to control the narrative. But Sarah wasn't backing down. "We have to make sure the world knows what really happened here," Sarah said. "Mark, get the footage from the security cameras, from the drones. We've got proof, and we're going to make sure it gets into the right hands." The battle for control of the spaceport was still raging, but Sarah knew that the true fight was happening in the court of public opinion. The media was the battlefield now, and if she was going to win this fight, she needed to ensure that the truth came to light. "We're not just fighting for this spaceport," Sarah said to her team, her voice steady with conviction. "We're fighting for everything. For the people who are being exploited, for the future of this industry. We can't let them win." And with that, Sarah knew that the fight had truly begun. The stakes had never been higher. In the days following the assault on the spaceport, the world's eyes were firmly fixed on the unfolding events. What had started as a local rebellion against corporate corruption had exploded into an international scandal. News outlets from across the globe were flooded with footage of the siege, of Sarah and her team standing firm in the face of overwhelming odds. Yet, as expected, Aerospace Dynamics wasted no time in launching a counteroffensive, this time, in the media. Sarah sat at the command center, her gaze fixed on the large screen in front of her, which displayed the live coverage of the ongoing debate between public figures and corporate representatives. It was a heated exchange, but the tactics were clear. Aerospace Dynamics was desperately trying to spin the narrative. The company had called the entire episode an isolated incident and referred to the heroes who had fought at the spaceport as extremists. They claimed that the spaceport's staff had started the violence, and now they were framing Sarah's actions as the cause of public unrest. "They're framing us as terrorists," Mark muttered from beside her. "We knew they'd fight back, but this is something else." Sarah clenched her jaw, her fists tightening on the edge of the table. She knew they were being painted as villains, but this wasn't just about clearing their names. It was about ensuring that no one would ever forget what happened here. The media was her battleground now, and she had a plan to fight back. A day after the initial broadcast, the team regrouped to discuss their next steps. They could feel the weight of public opinion shifting under their feet as the media began to churn out more and more stories that seemed to serve only one purpose: to protect Aerospace Dynamics and silence the truth. But Sarah had something the corporate giant didn't: the truth. "Mark, I need everything. All the footage, all the recordings from the drones, the security cams, the internal memos," Sarah said. "We need to show people exactly what happened, not what they're telling them." Mark nodded, his fingers already typing furiously. "It's all in the system. I've got everything backed up. I'll get it out to every media outlet I can. We need to make sure that no one can ignore us." At the same time, Raphael's team was making preparations for any further attacks, knowing that Aerospace Dynamics wouldn't give up easily. The company had vast resources, and with the tide turning against them, it was only a matter of time before they launched a counterattack. But for now, the drones patrolled the perimeter, and military forces had fortified key positions in the spaceport. They were ready, but the real battle would take place in the hearts and minds of the public. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were at a crossroads. She was no longer just fighting for the spaceport. She was fighting for something bigger, for the future of humanity's space exploration, for the safety of workers who would have to fight against corporate greed, for the integrity of systems that had been manipulated by people like Travis Campbell. The pressure weighed heavily on her shoulders. She had led them to this point, but the final step required every ounce of her resolve. Meanwhile, Travis Campbell had retreated into the private confines of his office, but his mind was far from at ease. The initial shock of the spaceport's attack had worn off, but the implications were far-reaching. He had underestimated the power of Sarah's movement, but now he would correct his mistake. He wasn't going to let her take down everything he had built. Not now, not ever. "Get me the board," Campbell snapped, picking up the phone. "We need to strategize. This is getting out of control." As the heads of Aerospace Dynamics filed into the room, Campbell wasted no time. "We're going to do this my way," he said, his voice cold. "We've already released the statements, but it's not enough. We need to hit back harder. I want every outlet that's supporting them shut down. I want their supporters discredited. If we have to, we'll turn the public against them." Aboard the private jet that took him to their headquarters, Campbell's mind worked overtime. He had already positioned his people in key places within the government, law enforcement, and the media. If he couldn't silence Sarah with words, he would crush her with power. But something about the way the public was reacting worried him. The more they fought, the more people rallied behind them. He needed to stop it before it became an unstoppable force. Back at the spaceport, Sarah and her team watched the fallout from the media war unfold. The attacks were relentless, but they weren't backing down. They couldn't. Every bit of footage they had, every piece of evidence, was going public, whether the media liked it or not. Sarah had made it clear: the truth would win out in the end. "We've got their response," Mark said, slamming his tablet down on the table. "But it's too late. The public's already picking up on the discrepancies. People are starting to dig deeper into the facts." Sarah nodded, her eyes narrowing as she watched the responses flood in on social media. The voices of support were growing louder. Citizens were sharing their own stories of how aerospace dynamics had hurt their communities, their families, their futures. What had once been a small rebellion was now an international movement, one that could not be easily ignored. The truth is spreading faster than they can stop it, Sarah said quietly. We've got momentum on our side. It wasn't long before the public backlash against aerospace dynamics reached a boiling point. Protests began popping up outside their offices, outside their factories, and even in the streets. People were demanding accountability, and the corporation could feel the pressure mounting. In a desperate move, Travis Campbell called for a press conference. His hands gripped the podium as he stared at the camera, his expression stone cold. "This situation has escalated beyond our control," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "What started as a minor incident has now become a full-fledged assault on the very foundations of our company. We will not stand by and let this group of extremists tear apart everything we've worked for. We are taking legal action, and we will stop at nothing to ensure our future." The audience's response was mixed. Some cheered, rallying behind the corporate giant's call for control. Others remained skeptical, questioning the legitimacy of the company's claims. Sarah and her team watched from their command center, knowing this would be a turning point. Meanwhile, Sarah was preparing for the next step in their strategy. The time had come to make the final push. "I've been in touch with some key lawmakers," Sarah said, addressing her team. "We're going to take this fight to the courts. The public has spoken. We have the truth. Now we're going to make sure that no one can hide behind their lies anymore." As the protests continued to grow, the pressure on both sides intensified. The final showdown between Sarah and Aerospace Dynamics was drawing near. And this time, the stakes were higher than ever before. Sarah had one goal now, to finish what she had started. The future of the spaceport, the future of humanity's space exploration, and the future of those who dared to stand up for the truth, all rested on what came next. The air was thick with anticipation as Sarah stood at the front of the makeshift stage set up in the heart of the city. Thousands of people had gathered, workers, families, activists, and even former employees of Aerospace Dynamics. They had all come for one reason: to demand justice. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she adjusted the microphone. The crowd was chanting, their voices reverberating through the streets, calling for change. This was it, the moment she had been working towards since the first assault on the spaceport. The time to fight back against the corporate giants had come. "Thank you," Sarah began, her voice firm and steady, echoing through the microphone. "Thank you for being here today. You've shown that we are not just fighting for the future of a spaceport. We are fighting for a future that values people over profits, truth over lies." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Sarah felt a surge of energy. The fight had been long and hard, but now they had reached the final stage, the showdown that would determine everything. Meanwhile, back at Aerospace Dynamics, the pressure was mounting. The protests had escalated, with more and more workers walking out, leaving their posts at the corporation's facilities. The media had turned against them, and the once untouchable company was now scrambling to hold onto its power. But Travis Campbell, ever the manipulator, wasn't giving up. He was in a boardroom meeting, surrounded by his top executives and legal team. The walls were lined with polished wood, but today, they seemed to close in on him. The sense of power he once felt was slipping through his fingers. It was clear that the public perception was turning against them, and despite all his efforts to control the narrative, the tide was shifting. "We can't let them win," Travis said, his voice cold. "We have the resources. We have the law on our side. We need to shut this down now, before it gets out of hand." His legal team nodded in agreement, but one of the senior executives spoke up, her voice cautious. "Travis, we've tried everything. The media, the legal action, but the protests are getting bigger. Public sentiment is turning. If we push too hard, we might lose everything." "Then we fight harder," Travis snapped, his fingers drumming against the table. "I won't let this company go down because of a few rebellious employees and a misguided movement. We've built this empire from the ground up. They won't take it from us." Sarah, however, wasn't backing down. She had spent days preparing for this moment. With the support of the people, the footage of the siege, the undeniable truth that had been exposed, She had gathered everything needed to put an end to Aerospace Dynamics' reign of corporate greed. As she continued her speech, she looked out at the sea of faces in front of her. Their eyes were filled with hope. Hope that their voices could be heard. Hope that things could change. And she knew that it was now or never. Aerospace Dynamics has shown us who they really are. They don't care about us. They don't care about the workers or the people affected by their decisions. They care about their profits. But we are showing them today that we are stronger than their lies. We are standing together, and we will not be silenced. The crowd cheered again, their voices rising in unison, a wave of support for Sarah and her team. Back at the command center, Mark and David were watching the events unfold live. They could see the impact of the speech, the people rallying behind Sarah's words. It was working. But they also knew that the real battle was happening behind the scenes. Aerospace Dynamics was fighting to regain control of the narrative. We need to keep the pressure on, Mark said. We can't let them spin this in their favor. Sarah's got the public on our side, but we need to make sure that the truth stays in the spotlight. I'll keep pushing the media coverage, David replied, his fingers flying across his keyboard. We've got all the footage from the spaceport, the legal documents from the company's wrongdoings. If they think they can bury this, they're wrong. The two exchanged a determined look. They had come this far. They weren't about to let Aerospace Dynamics reclaim the upper hand now. As the day wore on, the protests continued to grow. Sarah's speech had ignited a fire in people's hearts, and the crowds were swelling in numbers. The energy was electric, a palpable sense of solidarity among the people who had gathered to fight for what was right. But Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice wasn't just about what was happening in the streets. It was about what happened in the courts, in the boardrooms, and in the halls of power. And she wasn't going to rest until she had taken down the corporation that had caused so much harm. The legal team was already mobilizing. Sarah had made sure that the right lawyers, the right allies, were in place. It wasn't just a matter of public opinion anymore. It was time for legal action. The evidence was undeniable. The unlawful practices, the corporate greed, the disregard for workers' rights. They had it all, and now, it was time to make sure that Aerospace Dynamics was held accountable. By the evening, the protest had turned into a full-fledged movement, with people across the globe speaking out against corporate corruption and injustice. Social media was abuzz with posts, hashtags, and live streams from the protesters. The world was watching, and Aerospace Dynamics, despite all their attempts to suppress the truth, was beginning to crumble under the weight of their lies. Travis Campbell sat in his office, staring at the news reports. He had underestimated the people, underestimated Sarah. He had thought they could control the narrative, but now, it seemed like they were losing control of everything. He picked up the phone, his voice low. It's time. We need to go public with our next move. But Sarah was already a step ahead. She had anticipated this, and the world was ready to listen. The people were no longer afraid. They were no longer willing to be silenced. As the final moments of the battle played out, it became clear that Sarah and her team had won. The truth had come to light, and the people had rallied behind it. Aerospace Dynamics had been forced into a corner, and there was no way for them to escape the consequences of their actions. In the end, the corporation was forced to pay restitution to the families of the workers they had exploited, to invest in safer practices, and to reform their business operations. The victory was hard-won, but it was a victory nonetheless. Sarah stood on the steps of the courthouse, looking out over the crowd. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow on the scene. The people had spoken, and their voices had been heard. The future, once uncertain, now seemed full of promise. Today, we've made history, Sarah said, her voice carrying over the crowd. This is just the beginning. We've shown the world that when we stand together, we can take down giants. And we will keep fighting for justice, for truth, and for a better tomorrow. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing across the streets. The battle was over, but the revolution was just beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?